Good morning, my lords, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming out on this wonderfully Labour Day. The weather could barely be more miserable for July if it tried. I blame the government. It is wonderful that so many have come together today to not gloat at the colleagues we wanted to lose and lost, not just to commiserate with those very hard-working, very dedicated, wonderful MPs who will no longer be representing us. Not to celebrate how badly we've done, not to bemoan how badly we've done, but to understand, to look to our history, of which we have a huge deal to be proud of, and work out how to forge our future with the same success. It is time for contemplation. It is time to understand why the electorate left us, why our members have left us, and what we can do to turn that around. It is not a time for blame. It is a time to look to the future. Here are to the sunny uplands under the next Conservative government. We have a wonderful lineup of speakers. Mark Littlewood of Popular Conservatism needs little introduction, but has been at the forefront of fighting for conservative principles for decades. David Starkey has an understanding of the historical perspective unparalleled. Lord Frost, who has done so much to fight for real conservatism and understanding what the electorate want. Suella Braverman will be beamed over from Washington, who has also been helping our party forge to the future. There's some bloke called Jacob on my list. I'm not sure if I know who he is. I think he's my brother, but I'm sure he'll have wise words. And we will also hear from David Campbell Bannerman, who with the Conservative Democratic Organisation has been doing such profound work to ensure that us, the mere members, the backbone of the party, the people who knock on doors come rain or shine, have our voices heard by those in Parliament. We have a long way to go. The hard work starts again right here. If I may hand over to Mark Littlewood.
Well, thank you, Annunziata. Good morning, everybody. You've already referenced the weather. I'm sure you stole that joke from me last night. I things are already getting worse under a Labour government. But let's be honest, there are some pretty big benefits of opposition too, right? We can actually hold big meetings in Westminster without now being serenaded by Steve Bray. So look, thanks for joining us for this PopCon event here in Westminster and online, which we've called Beginning the Rebuild. Thursday night was brutal. Perhaps not surprisingly so, but brutal nonetheless. And I speak to you today as a member of the Conservative Party, but also as a fan of Southampton Football Club. Believe me, I know what brutal defeat feels like. I think in truth, looking back now, we could all feel it on the doorstep. My most dispiriting doorstep conversation was a rather strange one. A gentleman answered the door, gave me a very broad smile when he saw my blue rosette, and immediately said, "If Labour win, I'm going to leave the country." This, for those of you who don't go canvassing very much, is usually a very good sign. Not for the economy or the country, obviously, but for marking down a definite C on your paperwork. So I smiled back and thanked him, and I was about to mark him down as a definite C and take my leave when he added, to my horror, "Mind you, if the Conservatives win, I'm going to leave the country too. I'm just not a very political person, I just like travelling." Perhaps that apocryphal gentleman rather summed up our campaign. We thought we had millions of votes in the bag, but dig a little deeper. Wait for their second sentence. Listen to their fuller sentiment. And no, we didn't. So, of course, dozens upon dozens of Conservative MPs have been swept away, including cabinet ministers, household names, and a swathe of decent Tories who are just damned good constituency MPs, but got blown away in the hurricane. As Mark Twain very nearly said, some of our greatest people are dead, and I'm not feeling too well myself. But for those who did lose on Thursday, or didn't quite make it onto the green benches for the first time, I'd say please stay with us. We don't just need to build a Conservative parliamentary party from this low base, we need to build a Conservative movement and a Conservative family, and that will require a good number, all of those candidates who didn't get over the line last Thursday, to stick with us. As we know, the Conservative Party lost about 2/3 of its seats and not far off half its national vote share. Labour has won an enormous majority, despite securing only a little more than 1/3 of the vote. To begin what could be a very long march back to power, we've convened this gathering today, honestly to consider what went wrong, how to put it right, and how the Conservative Party needs to change to win back the millions of supporters it has lost. Perhaps I can say just a few words about PopCon's overall approach and philosophy. We are a grassroots-based organisation, not a parliamentary-based group. Today, therefore, this meeting isn't a beauty parade or a leadership hustings in any size, shape or form. It's the beginning of a discussion, which will no doubt evolve and develop in the weeks and months ahead. It's my hope that Conservatives of all types can have the discussion honestly, frankly and meaningfully without descending into factionalism or recriminations. We need to work out what went wrong, why and how to put things right. Such an inquiry needs to be deep, meaningful, forensic and sincere. It also needs to be conducted in good faith and ecumenically. From PopCon's perspective, let me remind you of our broad brush analysis. First, we believe that over the last quarter of a century or so, we have allowed to grow up a statist infrastructure, quangocracy and legal system which all mitigate against sound Conservative policy. It doesn't make our sorts of policies, low tax, less regulation and secure borders, impossible to implement, but it does make it much more difficult. This, I believe, is why the country has not become more conservative after 14 years of Conservative-led government. Going forward, an overhaul of our institutions and a restoration of core constitutional principles is going to have to be a major part of the party's policy platform. In fact, it's pretty much a prerequisite to any future policy successes we may achieve. Now, at first blush, this may sound like a fool's errand, the obscure pursuit of a political nerd. No real voters care about the mandate of the Bank of England, the advice of the OBR, or the remit of the Climate Change Committee, do they? They care about bread and butter issues, surely. Healthcare, tax, pay rises, house prices and the like. That is, of course, true, but I'm not sure the two are wholly mutually exclusive. The Brexit vote in 2016 was, I would contend, based on a view that power had become too detached from the people. It was an intangible feeling, for sure, but also very real. The bread and butter arguments that your household income will be, what was it, £2,372.36 less in 4 decades' time, or whatever it was, or that trade friction might diminish GDP by a fraction of a percent, these were the arguments deployed by Remain, and their bread and butter arguments didn't work. They lost to a more principled argument, or at least a loftier one, that how power is exercised and by whom matters, not just the immediate and often immeasurable results of such exercises. Somehow, we need to find a way to marshal these arguments for institutional change and a constitutional restoration once again. There was precious little point in taking back control from the Brussels bureaucracy if it was merely to hand that control over to a network of undemocratic and aloof bureaucrats in and around Whitehall. How we hone and develop that case and the policies that go along with it is one of the great Conservative policy challenges of the coming years. Second, the Conservative Party itself is in danger of replicating the centralised, detached, arrogant and unresponsive practices and structures that have become endemic in the state itself. The man in Whitehall knows best is mirrored by the man in CCHQ knows best. Membership has fallen as members feel disenfranchised and powerless. CCHQ, many feel, has become more a command and control centre than a service centre, which is what it should be. Democratising the party is a necessary step to building a thriving and effective grassroots movement. CDO, the Conservative Democratic Organisation, takes the lead in pushing for such an overhaul, and I'm delighted to back them. John Strafford, who I believe is with us today, I can see him just over there, John, in the audience with his wife Caroline, has written and perfected the rulebook, the constitution that the party needs, and whoever emerges as our next leader, and whenever they emerge, they should embrace it firmly and enact it fully. John, thank you very much indeed for your tireless work. Third, any analysis of our defeat last Thursday needs to pay proper heed to the rise of Reform UK. In very rough and ready terms, vote shares for each of the major parties did not actually change that much as a total national percentage, with one, maybe two, major, massive and glaring exceptions. The dramatic fall-off in the Conservative vote was more or less mirrored by a significant uplift in the Reform vote compared to that of the Brexit Party in 2019. Not exactly, but not far off. Now look, it's far too simple to look at different parties' vote totals and contrive ways to add them together. Parties receive votes, they don't own them. Nevertheless, on one analysis by The Telegraph, had Reform not run any candidates at all, 80 additional Conservative MPs would have been elected, and that was based on polling suggesting that about 36% of Reform voters would have switched to the Conservatives if they did not have their own candidate to vote for. That, of course, doesn't factor in the possibility that this figure would presumably be much higher if the Conservatives had run on a manifesto which bore greater similarities to that of Reform, that is to say, a manifesto which was unambiguously conservative. We need to be 100% clear about this and the impact on the result. This is not Nigel Farage's fault. It is not the fault of millions who voted for Reform. If the Conservative Party vacates Conservative territory, someone else will come and fill it. Nature abhors a vacuum, politics even more so. It was our fault. So, as we consider the positioning of the Conservative Party going forward, I'm sceptical of some of the suggestions that elections are always won from the centre ground. Insofar as this is true at all, it is only trivially true. In my lifetime, I believe the largest Conservative vote share at a general election was in 1979, when Margaret Thatcher came to power. The most decisive Conservative victories in terms of majorities in Parliament in my lifetime have been 1983, Thatcher, 1987, Thatcher, and 2019, Boris and Brexit. It's not at all obvious to me that these successes were achieved by identifying the pots of gold at the end of the muddled and hazy centrist rainbow and dashing towards them. The true challenge, of course, is to get whatever the centre is to move towards you. An electoral strategy based on charging to a centre ground that is hard to define and may not even really exist is an approach of being so open-minded that you can't keep anything in. Let me finish with a hard-to-reach-for upbeat note after Thursday's result. It was bad, very bad, but not quite as bad as it might have been. The Conservatives came a clear second in vote share, in line with most, but by no means all, national opinion polls. The Conservatives are unambiguously the official opposition to the government. Again, not all polls suggested that outcome was certain. In other words, it's bad. It's very bad, but it's not Canada bad. There's just a little bit of maple syrup to add just a tiny dash of sweetness to a bitter overall result. This means, I'd argue, that as far as the future of centre-right politics in Britain is concerned, the ball starts in the Conservative Party's court. If we can regroup, rethink, and set out a compelling way forward, we are still afforded a serious prospect of electoral recovery and a return to government. We don't have a God-given right to recover, nor to command any given slice of seats or votes, but we do have an opportunity to return to office if we think clearly, act logically, and above all, listen to the electorate, and especially the right-of-centre electorate, much, much more attentively. It's often said that the darkest hour is just before the dawn. That's not really true, of course. Here in London, the darkest hour is when you get mugged and get your wallet stolen. It's only a good few hours after that that the sun rises. So let's not try to get mugged in the immediate aftermath of this dark hour. Let's appreciate that it may take a while before the sun rises again. But when it does, and it will, let's make sure that Conservatives are ready to lead our great country again. It could be a long few hours before the sun rises again, but let's try and get through the first few minutes of those long, long hours this morning. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us. Those were just some of my initial thoughts, but to share some, no doubt, deeper and much more lucid thinking is a man who's become a vital ally of mine in recent months. He's one of our nation's great historians. To me, however, over lunch, just before we launched PopCon way back in February, this man was able to distill and explain the UK's constitutional predicament in such a compelling fashion that it set the tone of that launch meeting and indeed Popular Conservativism's mission statement. please give a very warm welcome to the brilliant, the irrepressible David Starkey.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was a wonderfully rousing introduction, but I'm afraid it completely failed to give you the essential qualification that I have to stand here. Ladies and gentlemen, my father was a toolmaker. My mother, by the way, scrubbed floors. Other people's floors. If we're going to play this absurd game of more working class than thou. Oh, by the way, I was born in a 3-bedroom pebble-dashed house. I went to grammar school. I was a scholarship boy. I did not, however, disgrace my school like Starmer by getting only 2 B's and a C's. Right, enough of the nonsense. Let's go back to, can I just say, it's vital to recognize Starmer is not very clever. He's a little bit like a junior Gordon Brown. And like Gordon Brown, he's very thin-skinned. Humor, wit, cleverness, fleetness of foot, needling will get that man. Right. Now, what has happened? Well, again, Annunziata said history. History, we've been here absolutely before. 50 years ago, can I remind you, was the moment in which Keith Joseph, in 1974, after another great election defeat, the defeat of Edward Heath, said, "I have not been a conservative. I have called myself a conservative. I've been a member of a conservative government, but I haven't been conservative, and that government hasn't done conservative things." And that is the beginning of Margaret Thatcher's revolution. That government of Edward Heath, began with all the right resolutions. Indeed, talking of, as it were, not winning from the centre, it began with the Selsdon Declaration of free market economics. It then, under the pressure of events, immediately collapsed back into Keynesianism. Inflation, the Barber boom was exactly the kind of thing that Rishi Sunak triggered. Do we know property prices in London in 1972-3 rose 3 times? Inflation on extraordinary scale. Thatcher recognised that. Thatcher was taught by Keith Joseph what conservatism was. The great discovery for her of Hayek, the realization that socialism destroys countries, that it destroys freedom, that it destroys everything that made the West, and particularly Britain, the pioneer country in all of this, great. And the result of that extraordinary revolution of 50 years ago was Margaret Thatcher and the recovery of a genuine conservatism. But of course, always with one nation, or as Margaret beautifully described it, no nation conservatives fighting against it. So we have been here before. Margaret had to cope with an internal enemy, and I'm sorry I'm using that word. She was totally unambiguous. There were those on side and there were those offside. We have to recognize that. She also recognized centrally and absolutely that you have to undo before you can do. She repealed trade union legislation. She repealed nationalisation. She opened up public sector housing. An incoming Tory government will have a real one, will have to do all of those things. So what our failure has been is that we've forgotten the lessons of Margaret Thatcher. And what I would like to begin by doing, we're engaged essentially at this stage now in a process of the conversion of the party, its members, who I don't think need much conversion, but more particularly in the conversion actually of our MPs. They need to be given Margaret Thatcher's Keith Joseph lecture. It needs to have, because many of them are not very good at reading, it needs actually... it needs actually to have a simple series of the big statements. I'm being deadly serious. This needs to be circulated. Right. Why is it that centrism doesn't work? It's very simple. Left is wrong and right is right. No, see, this is not a moral statement. This is a statement of absolute, observable, testable historical truth. Socialism always fails. Always, always fails. A sensible, sensibly regulated, intelligently applied free market economics always, always works because it is founded on freedom. The thing that has created the West is freedom. If you look at the Labour Party's manifesto, there is simply not a single reference to that word freedom in it. Now, why then has the left won again? Why has Starmer won? What happened? Well, let's just look at it. We were told again by Annunziata not to blame. I'm sorry, I have to. If we go back to 2005, to Cameron coming to power as leader of the Tory party, there was this notion that we have to move left, that we have to move in the wrong direction. And that is exactly what happened. When finally they won, or they didn't win, the coalition came in 2010, Blair's memoirs were handed round, particularly marked up by Michael Gove, with the description, this was the new Machiavelli, this is how we should rule. And the catastrophe begins there, the absolute disaster and the shame, because we vacated the ground that is properly ours. What is a Conservative Prime Minister doing? I am gay. What is a Conservative Prime Minister doing when he says his greatest achievement is gay marriage? It is deranged. What is Theresa May doing when she says that we will actually legislate a binding commitment to net zero? What is she doing when she talks about burning racial injustices, when we're the most equal society in the West? We equal, of course, once because we had actual equality under the law, something, again, that we've forgotten. Because what that acceptance of what Blair did is exactly as Mark referred to before, it involved the destruction of what Margaret Thatcher realised was what had held Britain's greatness together, which is a unique system of parliamentary government which guaranteed, and something quite extraordinary, a continuation between past and present and future, which took its power not from abstract notions of sovereignty, but from the fact that Parliament holds its sovereignty, is sovereign, because it represents everybody. This idea going back to the very end, to the very beginning of parliamentary history, to the 13th century, in which the judges would rule to some sort of recalcitrant little bod somewhere in Yorkshire who said, no, I will not pay my taxes. The judges would say simply, yes, you will, because you're bound by Parliament, as everybody in England is present in Parliament, either in person or by his representative. So the first thing we've got to do, and again, Mark referred to this point brilliantly, we've to educate people. We've a vast, vast task of educating our MPs and of educating the public. We've abandoned this. We've abandoned the public sphere to the left. We have to reclaim it. We have to reclaim it with clear language. Because what has happened with that abandonment of the idea of Parliament at the centre is we have deliberately removed, and Mark, I think, remembered our conversation quite well, but he left out the central point. If you marginalise Parliament in decision-taking, you remove the only body that is directly subject to popular scrutiny. If you have Bank of England setting interest rates, if you have the Supreme Court deciding when Parliament can be dissolved or when it can't, if you had judges determining whether or not we can drill for oil, as the latest extraordinary thing has happened, none of those people are answerable to you. The entire process of government becomes remote, alien. That is why there was that passionate desire for taking back control with Brexit, but it transpired that Brussels wasn't the person that was tying down the great British people, so supreme in freedom, so supreme in the creativity. It wasn't Brussels that was tying us down. It wasn't Brussels that was wrapping us in bonds, if you remember, like the Lilliputians with Gulliver. It was the Quango. It was the disgracefully politicized civil service. It was all of that was doing it, and we did nothing about it. We connived. We did not repeal. The first thing that a serious incoming Conservative government has to do, quite simply, is to repeal the whole of the legislation of New Labour, the setting up of the Supreme Court, the incorporation of the Human Rights Act, the Equality Act, all have to be repealed. Because again, can we get this quite clear? Human rights sounds lovely and cuddly. The left has perverted language. Human rights are not cuddly because human rights have been perverted. They're now designed to protect minorities against the majority. Human rights, this is why Churchill would not have approved. It's constantly, the left constantly says this is Churchill's creation. Churchill created human rights, mistakenly in my view, or created the idea of the European Convention to protect the individual against the state. If instead you decide that the purpose of human rights is to protect the minority against the majority, you can only do that by an aggressive state that limits the freedom of the individual, as we see catastrophically with the limits with the attempted limits on the freedom of speech. That absolutely central thing. We are the creation of freedom of speech. This is the only reason that this tiny little island invented virtually the whole of modernity. It is actually a logically sustainable, historically sustainable statement that we invented modernity. So the left, this is where centrism goes wrong. All left-wing parties have to move to the centre because they've got to disguise themselves with right-wing policies to be elected. That is exactly what Starmer has done. And isn't it a sign of our disgrace that in our folly we abandon the prisons so they can no longer hold prisoners? We starve the army in favour of what? In favour of foreign aid, so that Labour can now pose as the party of NATO and defence. This is the disgrace. And the moment, of course, the right tries to move to the centre and adopts left-wing positions, as we've seen in this election, it is a catastrophe. However, I think there is hope. If my analysis is right, that what we have now is a state in which there's a fairly clear divide. And a divide, interestingly enough, which Starmer himself has actually admitted. Why does Starmer talk so loudly about the public service? It is, and why does he also talk so loudly and misleadingly about his father being a toolmaker? It is, quite simply, because the Labour Party has ceased to be the party of the working class. It is now the party of a new ruling class. It's the party of the quangocracy, of the judges, of the civil service, of the public sector trade unions. In other words, when it fails, which it will fail, because left-wing governments always fail, we will see standing exposed the whole of this machinery. The whole of this machinery that hates one thing, ladies and gentlemen. It hates the people. It hates Parliament. It hates democracy, for the simple reason it is only the people that have actually proved resistant to the absurd doctrines of woke. It is only amongst the people that you will find a clear understanding that women do not have a penis, that chaps do not have a cervix. It is only amongst the people that you will find a clear understanding that once upon a time it was the birthright of an Englishman and even an Englishwoman to speak freely, and from that freedom arose everything that mattered. So what I would like us to do then is to also recognise, because we all need to recognise our failures, Thatcher failed too. Thatcher failed because you couldn't do everything at once. She sorted out the extent to which there had been nationalised industries. She cut back enormously on trade union rights. She began to open up public sector housing. But she left utterly untouched this entire fabric of state institutions. She left untouched the NHS. She left untouched the civil service, the universities, the lot. Of incoming Conservative government has got to recognise that these are the points of attack. These are the points at which we have the soft underbelly of those opposite. And we've got to recognise again, it's a proud thing to say, conservatism speaks for the people. We need to remember that. We need to be absolutely clear about that. I will end with a book which I think, I've been constantly referring to it, which describes so many of the problems we face now, 1984. Those of you who are familiar with 1984 will know who the members of the party are. The members of the party are exactly whom you would expect. They are the school teacher, they are the bureaucrat, they are the so-called educated middle class. And outside, there's the great mass of the proles who continue drinking their beer and leading reasonably free lives. They're the people we will depend on. They're the people who voted for reform. They're the people that we've got to reincorporate in the party, but on a very different basis from Farage, a basis that recognises the history of the country, that recognises the history of the Conservative Party, that recognises the history of Parliament, and its ability to incorporate and to bind and to do that most wonderful Burkean thing of binding up the generations of past and present and future. The risk is, ladies and gentlemen, we do not want a right, as there is on the other side of the channel, a right which is as radical and as destructive and as dangerous as the left. We are better than that. Never let us forget it.
David, thank you very much indeed. And now from one speaker, David, our last speaker, who, as I mentioned, I owe an awful lot to in recent weeks and months, to our next speaker, who I owe an awful lot to over very many years. Our next speaker and I were contemporaries at university back in the early 1990s. And back then, I was a lily-livered, RIMP-listed Europhile Romaniac. And this gentleman was my adversary. And he, over many years, changed my mind, showing that persistence, logic, and good humour can change people's minds, even mine, even someone as stubborn as I was. And he did. He changed my mind. I saw the light. I became a proud Brexiteer. So please welcome to the stage one of the most erudite and articulate proponents of conservatism in the country today. Give a very warm welcome to Lord Daniel Hannan.
This is the midnight. Let no star delude us. Dawn is very far. This is the tempest long foretold, slow to make head, but sure to hold. There's a curious convention in this country where winning an election doesn't just mean winning it in the sense of getting the most votes, it means beating expectations. It means outperforming the last opinion poll. And of course, by that standard, the Conservative Party didn't have such a bad night. We played a blinder on the expectations management. I've got to give the party strategists that. In fact, I watched the results coming in with a number of party donors, one or two of whom are in the room now, and I can honestly tell you that when the exit poll flashed up, the preponderant mood was relief. Just stop and think about that for a second. We lost half our vote, we lost 2/3 of our MPs, and the immediate reaction was it could have been worse. My friends, this was a self-inflicted defeat. Every commentator has rushed to point out that the Labour Party is not benefiting from any great surge of enthusiasm, and of course that's true. I can't think of any winning party that has secured office with a lower share of the vote. But from our point of view, doesn't that make things even worse? Up against no opposition, we somehow still managed repeatedly to put the ball in our own net. I'm not going to push that parallel too far in advance of tomorrow's game. Now, there are mitigating factors. Of course there are. There always are. The first, to make an obvious point, is no party in modern times has ever won a fifth term. It's a hell of an ask to be re-elected 5 times in a row. I don't know how many of you spent the month before the election knocking on doors, as I did, but if you did, you'll have been struck by the sheer range of objections, some of them more sensible than others, that people had to the government. So among the reasons that I heard from ex-Tory voters for not voting Conservative this time was the badger cull, the post office scandal, and the fact that we're sending money to Zelensky. My point being, after 14 years in office, you are bound to accumulate a number of grievances, and people will attribute every irritation and imperfection to such a long-standing government. So I get that. By the way, does anyone know when, I'm excluding Dr. Starkey or other professional historians, the last time that a party won a 5th consecutive general election? Clue, you have to go back to before the Reform Act. I think it last happened when the Duke of Wellington was our party leader, a rather better Duke than the current Duke politically. When the Duke of Wellington was our party leader, and even then, that was the 1830 election, we were so pulverised 2 years later at the 1832 election that the response was to close the party down and relaunch it under Robert Peel as the newfangled Conservative Party, Tory men and Whig measures, as Disraeli put it. There was an even bigger mitigating factor, although it was curiously unmentioned throughout the campaign, which is our selective national amnesia about the lockdowns. Every government on the planet, pretty much, that was in office when the bills came in, suffered electorally. There were 1 or 2 which were sly enough to pick the moment during the pandemic crisis and increase their majorities, because at that time, when they were dominating the airwaves, when they were giving their statesman-like bulletins on the health crisis, they were almost unbeatable. So Justin Trudeau in Canada and Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand picked that moment. But it's a different thing when the bills come in. And actually, much of what I heard on doorsteps, and all of you will recognise this if you've been doing any canvassing, was really a complaint about the effects of a lockdown, which the country as a whole not only demanded, but wanted to go further. So people say, why are our taxes going up? Well, why do you think we paid people at home to stay home for 2 years? I mean, what was going to happen? Why have prices gone up? Well, we covered the difference by printing money. Why are NHS waiting lists so high? Well, duh, why do you think, right? I mean, but people do not like to be reminded of this. And therefore, every incumbent government has been in this difficult position. There was a moment in the very first leaders' debate when somebody in the audience raised the issue of NHS waiting lists. Rishi Sunak perfectly validly said, hang on, we've been through this pandemic, but waiting times are much longer in Labour-run Wales than in Conservative-run England, and the audience groaned. Because if you have crammed memory of the lockdown into the remotest corner of your mind, then any politician mentioning the subject comes across as whinging. So I say all this by way of accepting that there were mitigating factors. People don't want, I mean, mathematically, the laws of maths tell me that a lot of the people moaning about the impact of the lockdown must have been in the 71% who wanted to retain it when Boris lifted restrictions in the summer of 2021, let alone the 93% who backed it in the first place. But none of that excuses our unforced errors. None of that explains a defeat on this scale, the single worst result we have ever suffered as a party since that great and underrated man, Sir Robert Peel, established us with the Tamworth Manifesto. We made unforced errors of process and of policy. It was, I think, catastrophic to change 2 leaders without a general election, almost regardless of the qualities of the people involved, that is always going to come across to the electorate as a cabal of people handing down their choice and saying, you little voters, you will put up with whatever we give you. And we did it twice in 3 months. And our opinion poll standing never recovered. And of course, we made promises that we then didn't keep, above all on immigration. Yes, mitigating factors, there always are. We were in the EU at first, and then we had special schemes for Ukrainians and Hong Kongers and Afghans. But nonetheless, we repeatedly made promises and didn't keep them. Now, where does that leave us? I agree with what Dr. Starkey just said. This government will become unpopular because this immense majority is based on no commensurate sense of public enthusiasm. When Tony Blair came in 97, he brought, in the wake of that huge majority, if you like, a margin of benefit of the doubt. People were prepared to say, look, you've been left a tough situation and we'll trust you. That, if there is anyone arguing that today, they are keeping very quiet. So it may be that this record parliamentary majority, this Burj Khalifa of a majority, is in fact built on sand dunes. And when things turn tough, people will realize that all of the problems that were there under the previous government remain unaddressed. We are still spending massively more than we can afford as a country, fully 3 years after the end of lockdown and with the financial crisis a distant memory. And I see absolutely no sign of this government being prepared to bring spending even remotely close to where it was in February of 2020, prior to the pandemic. So when it's Keir Starmer having to send nurses away empty-handed or cut teachers' pay or whatever, the mood, I think, will change very quickly. The question is, who will be there to exploit it? Will there be an evident government in waiting? Serious, responsible, offering a coherent programme and able to step in with something better. What can we do to put ourselves in that situation? I have a couple of suggestions. The first may seem very dull, but it's important. You have to fix the plumbing. This campaign, just as a political campaign, was plainly lost by our party and plainly won by the other party. Now, in a way, that's kind of inescapable, right? When you've been in office for a long time, your best minds are going to be running Whitehall departments. The greatest talent in any governing party is going to be doing precisely that, governing, whereas all the best minds in Labour were focused on campaigning and winning. That is part of the seesaw of opposition and government in this country. But we do have to sort that out and we have to prioritise it. I can't remember a campaign when people haven't complained about candidate selection. But this time, I really was struck by how many very good people were not allowed to, one or two of whom again I see in here, were not allowed to fight winnable seats, and some rather more contestable decisions were made in favour of others. We do need to look at those mechanics. I mean, it would have been nice, wouldn't it, if we'd had a few more people in the party machine advising the PM on the election date rather than betting on it. It was an extraordinary unforced error. It's like that internet meme of the person putting a stick in his own bicycle wheel. We somehow managed to call an election which caught ourselves off guard, but not any of the other parties. And until we have fixed, on a very basic level, the machinery of the party, we don't expect to win the next one. Secondly, I think we need to be statesmanlike, right? By which I mean we should resist the temptation to attack everything that Labour does simply because Labour is doing it. Now, heaven knows there are going to be plenty of things that we do need to attack, from the tax rises that are surely coming to the insane decision to give the vote to people whom in every other context the Labour Party considers to be legally children. The Labour Party has enthusiastically said that if you are under 18, but over 16 you're not allowed to buy a knife or get a tattoo or get a mortgage or have Botox treatment or buy a bottle of wine or leave full-time work, but you should be allowed to vote on whether anybody else can do that. There's going to be plenty of stuff for us to oppose. But let's give them our support if we see them doing things that are basically conservative policy. Most obviously, building more stuff. Right? There's a lot of backlog of building decisions that we have tried to get through. If the Labour Party now tries to do them, we should do it. If, for example, they legalise onshore wind, which is one of the first decisions that they've announced, then our response should not be, oh, terrible, you know, you're putting hideous windmills on beautiful upland areas. It should be, yes, good, but why not extend the logic to fracking and other sources of energy? We should be a constructive opposition, and particularly this is true in the areas where Labour can do things that the Conservative Party can't. A point that Jeremy Hunt made in a very gracious and statesmanlike concession speech or victory speech in his constituency. Labour is trusted to do things on the NHS. Now, up until now, I've been very sceptical about whether they would do it. Wes Streeting talks about tough decisions. Taking them is a different matter. But it's just possible. Bringing back Alan Milburn, talking about putting the patient over the producer, it's just possible that we may get a move towards a more continental model of healthcare. And if Labour is doing that, we should support and not nitpick. And so on with benefits or pension reform or whatever it is. The big one, I don't need to repeat it all because we just heard it from David Starkey. A large part of what we got wrong and what created the space for reform was not a sort of unpatriotic, wet Tory party not trying. It was the inability of ministers to get things through hostile bureaucrats, quangocrats, and judges on everything from telling us what energy policy we're allowed to always and everywhere opposing every deportation order from the bench. And until we have fixed that, we're always going to find ourselves back where we are. We're in a very strange position where our media and political climate only wants to blame politicians. If civil servants are breaking lockdown rules, it's only of interest, it's only a story if in some way a minister can be said to be involved. Ministers are therefore blamed for decisions, whether it's repeated overturning of the Rwanda scheme, or whether it's failures of procurement, or whether it's people absconding from prisons, that a moment's thought would reveal that the minister doesn't want to happen, but that the entire machine is there to thwart the minister's will. I've been serving, I expect this won't last much longer, but I've been on the Board of Trade, and the extraordinary inertia there, the institutional resistance to lowering trade barriers, even for products that we don't have in this country. You know, we still, do you remember the great tomato shortage of last year when you couldn't get tomatoes apparently on any supermarket shelf? We were still imposing tariffs and quotas on non-EU tomatoes. We don't grow tomatoes in this country, not really. We have a very short season which doesn't clash by a single day with that of our main source countries, and yet we couldn't get a change as simple as that past our officials. Every time I raised it in Parliament, the minister would say, yes, this must happen. And he would say that so that it would be on the record in Hansard so that his officials would act on it. They never did. Why? Well, we'll all have our own theories, but I suspect in the end, the only explanation that works is that they were trying to hold the door open for some kind of customs deal with the EU under Keir Starmer, and they didn't want to diverge in any way from old existing EU trade policy because they thought that that might make things more difficult. If we can put our own house in order, then the question of relations with other parties of the right assumes a secondary importance. The surge in support for reform was primarily a consequence of Tory failure, as indeed most of my reform friends are loud and keen to tell me. Now, I'm not averse to having any kind of arrangements with anyone who is interested. In fact, in the run-up to the 2015 election, I argued that there should be some kind of pact between the Tories and UKIP, at least in seats where it would make a difference, a little bit like the UUP and the DUP used to do in selected seats in Northern Ireland. Obviously, my advice was not taken. Actually, UKIP in 2015 got a remarkably similar result to the result just secured by Reform. Okay, they didn't get any seats, but in terms of their share of the vote, in terms of the number of places where they came second, it was a comparable result. What happened then? Well, in the 2017 and 2019 elections, the vote of UKIP and then the Brexit Party fell away because we had delivered Brexit. And then we had Boris Johnson as party leader in 2019. In other words, we didn't fret primarily about what relationship to have with another party. We concentrated on doing the right thing, and that issue looked after itself. Now, like I say, I'm perfectly open to any amicable conversations, but all of that is secondary. The primary objective, under whatever leader, under whatever direction, must be to make ourselves the alternative vehicle for government. If you go back before 1834, if you count the Tory party as the prelude to our existing Conservative party, we are by a long way the oldest party in discovered space. We've been around for 3.5 centuries, and we've survived that long because, like Doctor Who, we can endlessly regenerate according to the needs of that moment. There is no reason why we shouldn't regenerate now, provided that, unlike Doctor Who, we don't go woke and forget what made us popular in the first place. And that, it seems to me, is our task, and that is why we are all gathered here today, to remember that oldest of Tory creeds, which is to prefer the organic and the evolved and the familiar to the planned and the imposed and the centralized, to speak, as Disraeli put it, for the sublime instincts of an ancient people.
Dan, thank you so very much. I've mentioned in our first two speakers that I owe them a great personal debt to David and Dan, but our next speaker I think we all owe a great debt to. We did finally get Brexit done, and in no short way that was down to the actions, decisions and bravery of our next speaker. He's already outlined in many columns in the Telegraph what he thinks has gone wrong and how we should put it right. But to hear it from the horse's mouth, please give a very warm welcome indeed to Lord David Frost. David.
Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you also, Dr. Starkey and Dan Hannan. It's always difficult, I'm afraid, to follow the last exponent of classical rhetorical techniques when you're speaking, and Dan exemplifies those today. My lords, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, we meet today at a moment of calamity for the Conservative Party. As others have said, we've just had our worst result for over 100 years. We lost over half of our 2019 vote and 2/3 of our seats. And worse, we have to sit and watch while Labour use the levers of government that we failed to use. And I'm afraid we have to accept the painful reality that, for the time being, nobody out there is that much interested in what we think. So soon, after the triumph of 2019 and of Brexit, we've fallen a long way. And I personally don't want ever to be in this position again. Now, it's true, it's right to avoid recriminations. It's right to avoid blame. There are many authors for this disaster. But it is also right to be angry about what's happened, for this catastrophe was entirely foreseeable and was indeed foreseen by many. I admit I feel angry myself. I came into politics to help deliver Brexit, as Mark kindly said. Having succeeded in getting it done and digging us out of the mess with Boris that one generation of Tory leadership had created, I found it hard to watch as we failed to deliver on the benefits under another. And I know I'm going to find it even harder to watch Brexit further watered down by a Labour Party that never wanted to do it in the first place. So those who decided upon the political strategy that got us here, those who stuck to it in the face of clear evidence it was failing, and those who then slandered and tried to kneecap their opponents in the party, they need to get off the stage as soon as possible and let the rest of us move on. Now, are we learning from this catastrophe? That is, I think, an open question. There is time, but we're already hearing people saying that the problem was that we tilted too far to the right and need to move back to the centre. We're already hearing people saying that the problem was untrammelled neoliberalism and free markets, and we now need a softer economics, more respectful of communities. Really? Which right exactly was this that we have lived through? Which free markets have these been? The ones that push tax and spend? The ones that push tax and spend to the highest ever levels? The ones that banned fracking, kept Soviet-style production targets for electric vehicles and boilers, and made our energy prices the highest in Europe? The ones that endlessly deferred to the doctrines of a foreign court rather than fix illegal migration? The ones that brought 1.5 million people into the country in 2 years and 5 million since 2010? I must have missed this right-wing paradise we've been living through. Ladies and gentlemen, no. The truth is that on virtually every issue we have followed the collectivist zeitgeist leftwards, and we left Conservative voters nowhere else to go until, of course, the rise of Nigel Farage and Reform. And even then, instead of accepting that we'd made a political mistake in allowing a challenger on the right, we acted as if, as a party, we had some sort of divine entitlement to people's votes, and spent our time complaining about the lèse-majesté of Reform and of their voters, desperately looking for an actual alternative to the liberal collectivism that we represented. Now, we must do better than this. The electorate is never wrong. We must learn from the kicking that we've been given, and the first thing is to get serious. What does that mean? It means not immediately descending into the mudslinging of a rushed leadership election. I can't see why we shouldn't have an interim leader and time to debate things properly. It means, as others have said, having a proper investigation into what's wrong with the party organisation at the centre and being honest with ourselves about what I can see is the party's near disintegration in many constituencies. And let's not forget the deep, deep hostility to our brand among many, many voters. But above all, it means getting serious about our own ideas. For politics is, or it should be, about ideas as much as individuals. And if we are to offer an effective critique of Labour's governance, we aren't going to achieve it simply by shouting "Yah boo" at everything they do. Take, for instance, Keir Starmer's comments in Downing Street on Friday. He wanders down Downing Street with the rent-a-crowd, and then perhaps he got a bit bamboozled by all those Union Jacks and had a senior moment and forgot which party he was actually leading, because he made a comment that stunned me. He said, I quote, "I want a politics that treads a little lighter on all our lives." Well, I had to laugh when I heard that. I mean, I doubt there is a single Labour MP who actually believes that. Labour's high tax, high regulation, high nannying, high hectoring, high banning manifesto is about as far from getting politics out of people's lives as anyone could imagine. And if anything convinced me that Labour's approach to government was going to be just meaningless words, then it was that comment. But how can we criticise? We pushed up taxes. We pushed up spending. It was us that made pet abduction a criminal offence and banned silent prayer by abortion clinics. It was us who tried to tell landlords which tenants they could rent to and stop them getting their property back unless the government agreed. And we too, after all, were going to ban smoking if we got the chance. So we've got to be serious about ideas. Our attack on Labour, and we absolutely must make it, our attack on Labour's got to be based on a credible set of ideas, a serious alternative proposition for how this country should be governed based on tried and tested Conservative philosophy. Now that involves much more self-confidence about Conservative ideas than we've shown in recent years. We need to keep on saying that conservatism is the best philosophy, and Dr. Starkey said it well. It's a philosophy that makes people freer and richer wherever it's tried. It's a philosophy to which much of the rest of the world is actually turning once again. But it's a philosophy that we lost sight of in a misguided attempt to modernise, drift left and be all things to all men. We turned conservatism into a publicly funded support scheme for pensioners and the asset-rich in southern England. We've got to shed this baggage. We've got to get back to our core ideas. We don't have to be embarrassed about them. These ideas can still be popular in the country, and quite often in polling, when you put these ideas to people without the Conservative brand attached to them, they are still popular. Across Europe, people are still voting for these ideas. What we've got to do is show how these ideas can solve the problems the country faces. We know what these problems are: a low productivity economy biased to the southeast, dependent on mass immigration, the crisis of governability that others have mentioned, weak national institutions enmeshed in a web of international treaties undermined by the quango and devolution state, the decline in belief in individual freedom and free speech, the growth in belief in group rights and controlled expression of opinion, and overall the gradual shift of the country leftwards to a collectivist mindset in which nothing can be achieved without the involvement of the state. Now, Labour are not going to reverse any of these trends. We know they're going to make them all worse. We, however, must be unashamed in saying we need to track back. We need to hold our nerve about our traditional Conservative ideas and values. We need to get back to supporting free market, nation-state conservatism, freedom, the free economy, our nation and its independence. We've got to stand up for getting the government off the back of the people and of enterprise, accepting the necessity, given what we've allowed to happen to the population and asset prices, of building millions of new houses where people need them, winning the cultural war for our history, traditional values, free speech, stopping immigration and building national cohesion again, and letting our governments actually govern so they can achieve all of this. These are mainstream ideas. So the way to win next time is to build the largest possible winning coalition by convincing people of the power of Conservative ideas like these to solve the country's problems. For politics isn't solely about following public opinion. It's about persuasion. It's about convincing people you have the best ideas. It's about moving this centre ground your way. That means we've got to be confident. We've got to persuade people our ideas are the best ones for the country. Then, by being recognisably Conservative, we will bring back the Conservative voters who left us. And by showing that our ideas are the best ones to fix the country's problems, we start to bring back everybody else too. So I reject, therefore, the caricature that what I'm arguing for, that what people like me are arguing for, the caricature that all this represents would be a shift to the narrow right, a move from one narrow bit of the political spectrum to another. Rather, it's a return to mainstream conservatism, attractive, coherent, conservative ideas which can attract many, many voters. What we'll be turning away from is simply from being all things to all men. We'll be turning away only from pushing a flabby mishmash of sub-socialist ideas. We'll be turning towards offering a real alternative, a properly thought-through conservative proposition and advocating it convincingly. If we can do this, for sure we can cooperate with reform. But as Dan said, if we can do this, perhaps there will be no need for reform. And if we don't do this, and instead draw the conclusion that we must tilt further to the crowded centre, such as it is, well then, we are leaving the whole political space of the right of British politics to others, to reform. That way lies destruction. We are perilously close to taking some bad decisions which could end up wrecking this party for good. Now, some people will be sad about that, in the way that it's always sad to see an old war horse at the end of its days, or to watch the Fighting Temeraire pulled in to port. But personally, I'm a loyalist to our ideas, not the institution. And if the party shows that it isn't interested in standing for our ideas and for conservatism, then what will be the point of it? Now, I don't think that worst-case scenario has to happen. We can get the philosophy right, as I've outlined. We can get a leader and a leadership team who understand the problem and want to fix it. By 2027, we can, if we work hard, have a single party of the right again, with no competitor to its right, and with a clear philosophy and policies ready to fight an election. That is absolutely doable if we get serious now. As Lady Thatcher said, and I quote, "First you win the argument, then you win the election." There is no shortcut to this. Hold our nerve, keep the faith, and get to work. Thank you very much.
David, thank you so much. Well, as a couple of us have mentioned, it wasn't all or entirely bad news everywhere on Thursday night. Some of our MPs did indeed make it back into the House of Commons. And in Fareham and Waterlooville, our candidate triumphed by what, in Conservative terms, now needs to be described as a landslide majority of 6,000. Now, I mentioned in my opening remarks that some said that they would flee the country if Labour won the election. Well, this woman has been true to her word. No sooner had the votes been counted and she had to head off to a conference in Washington, D.C. Albeit fleetingly, I know she'll be back with us soon. So she can't join us in person, but I was able to catch up with her via a video link late last night. So she won't be able to hear you, well, unless she has Doctor Who's TARDIS. She won't be able to hear you, but for the sake of the tape, please say a big hello, congratulations, and a very warm welcome to this conference to our former Home Secretary, Suella Braverman.
Mark, thank you so much for that warm welcome, and it is fantastic to be with Popcorn today, albeit virtually. This is not Big Brother is watching you, this is Suella Braverman beaming in from DC. And I've got to say, it's a pretty hot DC. There is a heat wave currently engulfing Washington, DC right now. And I have to say, I'm pretty happy to have gotten out of the UK and our brilliant summer weather of torrential rain. Is that it for summer now, do you reckon? Is that summer? I think summer is pretty much over. Very, very pleased to join you and to have emerged from the battle royale of last week's general election. I want to put on record my huge thanks to everyone at Popcorn, everyone in the room, for your steadfast support for our great party. Listen, these are dark days for us. We've just had a devastating result. We've lost a lot of good MPs, a lot of good Conservatives, and I know how hard many of you will have worked over the last 6 weeks of this campaign. It was challenging, it was grueling, it was brutal, and we have to now face the facts as to why we ended up in this situation and, importantly, what we do about it to move forward. And I know Popcorn is going to play a pivotal role in the renaissance of our Conservative Party, because boy, does the country need it. Labour has installed itself and will start its job of dismantling the structures that have enabled prosperity, that are the foundation of our law and order and the things that we cherish in this country to make our country great. And we need to be an effective opposition. We need to expose the dangers and the damage that they will be doing. And we need to do it effectively and in a way to bring back our voters. So what went wrong? Listen, there'll be lots of discussion right now. Now's the right time for analysis, post-mortem and inquiry. But, we lost half of our votes from the 2019 election. Our vote went down from about 13 million to just under 7 million. We lost 2/3 of our members of parliament, and we lost across all kinds of demographics. The realignment of 2019 was shattered. And of course, we're all learning our lessons right now, and learning is good, right? Learning is hard, I think, and I'm not sure everyone is necessarily ready to learn some politically and personally painful lessons, but we must learn these lessons. Now, we had a truly great majority in 2019. We were promising to do what the British people wanted. What did we do? We were going to use our Brexit freedoms. I campaigned for Brexit. I voted against Theresa May's deal to ensure we had a proper Brexit. But we were going to use our Brexit freedoms to stop the waves of illegal migrants landing on our shores. We were going to cut taxes. We were going to lower overall legal migration. We were going to stop the lunatic woke virus working its way through the British state. The harsh reality, this is the lesson we all need to learn and face up to, is that we did none of that. And then we tried sometimes, when campaigning, to pretend that we had done it. Because, what we mostly did after 2022, when Rishi Sunak was Prime Minister, was to roll out a programme that our new Labour government today could quite happily adopt, and probably will, on migration, on taxation, on the size of the state, on issues to do with politically correct nonsense in the public sector and indeed the corporate private sector. There were farcical gimmicks like proposed smoking bans applied to people depending on what year you were born. There was more and more regulation that we were passing on businesses, on housing and development. There was nonsense like letting criminals out early and scrapping shorter sentences for lower level crime, undermining confidence in our criminal justice system, letting down victims and demoralising the police, something I, together with colleagues, fought back against from the backbenches. Were there to be new homes to solve the housing crisis and to empower young people and to ensure that we could empower people to start a family, to settle down, to move forward with their lives? No. We talked big, we produced policy paper after policy paper, but when it came down to it, we did nothing of significance on house building. And what we also particularly didn't do was mention the war, but we didn't mention immigration. We didn't want to talk about immigration, we didn't want to see immigration. But immigration spiraled out of control, and we failed and refused to tackle head-on the discussion about the role of out-of-control population growth in one very small place and the pressure that that has put on pushing asset inflation sky high, on putting pressure on our public resources and our services, and on our cultural and national identity. Didn't want to talk about it, didn't want to look at it. And as a result, people felt very angry and very betrayed with our track record. So, to my mind, that's a diagnosis of what went wrong. And in a nutshell, that can be summed up as we did not do what we promised to do. People saw it. There was no getting away from the fact that we failed on our promises, and people voted accordingly at the ballot box. And, you know, the level of catastrophe really was aggravated by the fact that reform emerged on the political landscape as a phenomenon. Now, to my mind, the reform phenomenon was entirely predictable and avoidable, and all our own fault. It's no good denigrating reform voters. It's no good smearing the Reform Party. It's no good comparing reform rallies to the rallies of Nuremberg. That's not going to work. Criticising people for voting reform is a fundamental error to make. Historically, in British politics, we have had the monopoly on the right-wing vote. That's one of the reasons why we've been so successful politically. The left, by contrast, for the last 100 years, has been split. Left-wing voters have had a choice of party to go for. And we, by contrast, have had the luxury of a monopoly, but no longer. And that is why the Reform Party presents an existential threat to us electorally. To my mind, if there's any chance of our renewal or success, we have to accept the simple, basic truth that the Reform Party has taken many of our traditional lifelong voters. They are now their voters, and we need to do everything we can to win them back. There is space in British politics for only one Conservative Party, and at the moment, our place in that spectrum is under serious threat. So, what do we have to do to revive our fortunes? Well, I think there are three basic themes that we need to keep in mind. First of all, we need to restore trust, not just with the electorate, but actually within our own party. The integrity of the Conservative Party has broken down. For too long, grassroots members have been sidelined, disenfranchised, and treated pretty badly, to be honest. It was members who chose an election-winning Prime Minister in the form of Boris Johnson that led us to our success in 2019. And yet it was MPs who ousted him and replaced him with their choice of candidate. Rishi Sunak, installed by MPs, led us to our greatest defeat. This was really a way of robbing members of their right, of their voice, of their say. It cannot be allowed to happen again. In this election campaign, we saw associations, hard-working members on the ground who knew their communities best, be totally ignored and disrespected, and have inappropriate and, frankly, unsuitable candidates parachuted in because they were friends of those within the leadership, because they had worked at Number 10, because they were allies of those in power. A total undermining of democracy in our party. And we've seen many of those candidates go on to lose what were previously safe seats. Again, another example of how members must be re-enfranchised and re-empowered going forward in our party. That's how we restore trust. Secondly, we need to restore credibility on the core Conservative policies that unite all of us when it comes to being members of this great party. We need credibility on immigration. no longer have we been trusted to control and lower immigration because we've been weak, we've been squeamish, and we've failed to tackle this very pressing concern amongst the British people. Time after time, election after election, the British people have voted to cut migration, and the Conservative Party has disregarded those votes. So we need to actually show that we are serious and challenge the Labour agenda, which will be one of raising immigration. So on legal migration, we've got to point out, we've got to challenge, we've got to keep making the case for lower and more controlled immigration. And on illegal migration, I don't foresee this problem being solved anytime soon under this Labour government. They will make the UK a magnet for illegal migrants. They will only undermine our borders even further. And ultimately, they will grant an amnesty to those people who are here illegally and don't have a right to be in the UK. So we need to demonstrate that credibility on this issue by proposing and adopting as a party policy a view of leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. We've tiptoed around the subject for years. We've ummed and ahed. We've flirted with it, and we've, made all of the right noises. But ultimately, we've never been unequivocal about this pressing cause of the problem. We cannot control our borders. In fact, we don't have real sovereignty as long as we are judged and adjudicated by a foreign court in Strasbourg. So whoever is leading the party and whatever the composition of our party is, we must have now a policy of leaving the European Convention of Human Rights, scrapping the Human Rights Act, and ensuring that we have a human rights regime which is fit for purpose, reflective of British rights and responsibilities, and which will actually enable us to control our borders once and for all. We've got to lead that campaign. We've got to lead that discussion. And then lastly, what we need to restore hope. And I think this was something that was quite dispiriting throughout the campaign. The more that the Conservative Party seemed to mimic the Labour Party, it's also very difficult for voters to distinguish between the Conservatives and Labour on these issues like immigration, taxation, politically correct policies within the public sector. We were mimicking Labour. It was hard to distinguish the two parties. But fundamentally, we failed to give people inspiration, passion for our party, and hope. And so I believe we need to be the party that says that we are unapologetically patriotic, that we are the party that stands for duty, for service, the party that stands for the bonds of loyalty that have tied our society together and made us into a cohesive, organic unit. We are the party that stands for, ultimately, the true conservatism. And what I mean by that is a conservatism which says to people, we are the party of aspiration, but ultimately that we are also the champions of family, the party of duty, of love of our country, service to our people, respect for all, community, traditional culture specific to our nation, the party of home. We must fight to protect our national culture, which is precious because it unifies each and every one of us and it allows us to feel at home in our country. That culture, what do I mean by that culture? It's a culture that's contained in our customs, in our religion, in our traditions, in our common law, in our architecture, in our music, in our arts, in our educational institutions, in our sporting traditions, and in our constitution. These timeless virtues that have made our country great over the centuries, but of which we are not ashamed. Being British, being patriotic, loving our country, admiring and revering the spirit of the great British people is something that we should unashamedly occupy. And for too long, we've been nervous we've been reticent, we've been shy about demonstrating that love of our country. And aspiration. We need to be the party that makes it clear we're on the side of the grafters, of the strivers, of the people who take a risk to make their lives and the lives of their families and their communities better. We want to be the party that says, it doesn't matter where you come from, it's where you're going. And for me, those messages of aspiration and culture were severely missing in this campaign. And it's something that I very much dearly want my party to espouse and proclaim going forward. So those are my thoughts. Onwards, comrades. We can win. We can overcome. We've just got to learn these lessons. We've got to be honest. We've got to be patient with each other. But I do believe the opportunity is there and that we can prevail in the end. Thank you.
Thank you to Suella for recording that from across the Atlantic. Now, as we've pointed out, there's been a good number of victories, but many more losses, sadly, at the election on Thursday night. We only retained a third of the seats that we were defending. And although I hated to see all those losses, there was one that I think stood out for me somewhat, and I was really sorry to lose. And it does mean that our next speaker, sadly, no longer has the initials MP after his name. But there is an upside. He is such a national Conservative treasure that I know he will be a crucial public figure in putting forward the case for true conservatism in the days, weeks, months and years to come. So please give a very, very warm welcome to the stage to Sir Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming. This is wonderful. We had to move to a bigger room. So there are some Conservatives left. Because here we are, 5 days on. And what does it say behind me? It says PopCon. And I'm not sure we're either popular, and I don't think we were very Conservative. So it's slightly tricky. To have a conference under that name so soon. There's that great quip of Clement Attlee when he says to one of his ministers, a period of silence on your part would be welcome. And I have a feeling there may be people thinking that now, that a period of silence from us may be welcome. But it's not the right answer. Because we need to look at where we are, how we've got here, and where we're going. But we need to be realistic as well. We are now in opposition. We have no power. Now, you saw this yesterday when there was that really important reshuffle of the shadow cabinet. And the problem is, it doesn't matter. And we have to get to grips with that. There's the story which you will know about after the 1997 election when a minister, former, who has lost his place, goes out, gets into the back of his car and is surprised that it doesn't move. We have to remember that we are in that position, that the car doesn't move, the chauffeurs have gone, the red boxes have gone, the power, the excitement, the charisma of power has been taken away from us. And we must not assume that we just come back automatically. There are all sorts of reasons why we will have suspicions of the socialists. But if interest rates come down a bit, economy picks up a bit, expectations are low, Wes Streeting is, I think, a very interesting figure. They build a few houses. After 1846, and again I'm going to exclude the great David Starkey from answering, when were we next back in majority power? 1874, 28 years. But don't worry, because in 28 years' time, I'll be about the same age as Joe Biden, and if the country, calls upon me to serve, I should be only delighted to do so, and I'll probably still know my way around Somerset. So what we need at this stage, in my view, is humility but not despair. Because there is a strength in conservatism, as you've been hearing from the earlier speakers. Dr. Starkey didn't quite quote Margaret Thatcher, but he almost did when she said, "The facts of life are conservative." And that's something we should always remember. It's why ultimately the left moves to the centre, and we then get tempted by that when we've lost elections, and it is a mistake. And even for our failings, even for the inability to deliver what we believed in, 7 million people still voted Conservative, and the broader Conservative family won 11 million votes. So that's not too bad. And yes, I include Reform as the broader Conservative family. And sometimes families have their differences. But we need to reunite that Tory family and recognise that conservatism is more popular than the Conservative and Unionist Party. So we must think about what we can do. And there are three things. The easiest is that the job of the opposition is to oppose. And actually, having had to defend over the last few weeks some things that I thought were pretty ropey on doorsteps, opposition has its upside. It's quite easy. I went to Mass on Sunday morning, as you would expect. And as I was driving to Keynsham, there was a road, a small lane, where a whole load of rubbish had been tipped. It looked as if it had been tipped out of somebody's dustbin bags. And I thought, that's not my problem anymore. That's the problem of the government. They've got to clear it up. Opposing is something we should not be leery of in the right circumstances. But that is responding to events. There are also things we can do that are under our control. And most of what we should do is learning from history, because we are the Conservative Party. We believe in the history of our party, our nation, and of our families. And how pleased I was to hear Suella say that we need to put the family at the heart of any reinvigoration of the Conservative Party. We should not be ashamed to be pro-family. But what we can do, what is under our control, and learning from our history first of all, is the party structure. And we invented the idea of popular democratic activity after an election defeat in 1880. Disraeli's last election, when Gladstone won a large majority, our vote share and our number of seats went down heavily, and we set up the Primrose League. The Primrose League is really quite remarkable because those of you who remember it in its last days think of it as some frightfully fuddy-duddy, old-fashioned institution that gave out medals. But when it was founded, it was the first major popular political structure to give women the same involvement as men. It was really ahead of its time, and it worked out how to make politics fun. Now, you may look at what they thought was fun in 1880 and think that that may still be fun in the Rees-Mogg household, but probably not in too many other households up and down the country. And they gave each other medals and they gave themselves titles and all sorts of things. But they had fun, they enjoyed it. And do you know that within 10 years, they had over 1 million members? And that became a campaigning force. It got people to register. In those days, registration wasn't compulsory, so your first effort was to get people on the register. At their peak, they had 2 million members. And when it started, people were laughing at it. They were thinking, you can't do this. But it created the first popular political movement in this country. If you wish to be more modern, you can move to what we did after the Second World War and Lord Woolton, who is really very important because he did a number of things. One, he got rid of the chumocracy in the selection of candidates. And you may say that there had been an element of chumocracy in the selection of candidates before the last election. He got rid of it at different times by banning one simple question. Prior to his reforms, when you went to appeal to an association, pretty much the first question they would ask you was, how much can you donate to the association to keep it going? It wasn't quite rotten boroughs, but it was heading in that direction. Woolton introduced a rule that candidates could give no more than, if I remember rightly, £100 a year to their own association, so that you couldn't have people buying membership of Parliament. But he did much more than that. He worked out that you had to have a local base for your party activity. And I imagine all of you here know the local base in your own area and have seen it decline in recent years. Can I thank you for what you continue to do for your local base, because it is still fundamental where it exists. But by 1950, Lord Woolton ensured there were 527 out of the 542 seats in England and Wales that had agents. Now that created a party structure, and it created a local momentum. Do you know, in 2 months in 1948, he recruited 1,049,000 members by getting a structure and getting it to work and making localism happen. And that gave us the ability to campaign locally. It was also enjoyable, but it had a second string to its bow, something that still exists. Indeed, I used to belong to it many years ago with quite interesting other people. The CPC, the Conservative Political Centre. Why? Because the centre took the opinions of the association seriously. And when they sent in their thoughts and their views about how we should be governed and what policy should be, they were thought of highly in central office. So you had a local structure and you had a central office that minded about the localities. And as I said, it was fun. The Young Conservatives became a glorified marriage bureau in many ways. People enjoyed being involved with the party. We need to do something like this again. We need a party that people want to join, want to be involved with, and not the 1997 reforms which failed because they centralised, though they gave us one important thing, and that is the vote for the leader of the party. Now, if any of you belong to Conservative associations, bear in mind that rule can only be changed if Conservative association chairmen agree to it. Do you want me to tell you how hanging, drawing and quartering takes place? Because that's what you should do to your association chairman if he even thinks, or she thinks, of voting to take away your vote. Democracy must never be rolled back. And the idea that the MPs are so wise and know better than our members, well, look who they gave us and look who the members gave us. I'm with the members every time. So we need a party structure, and that is under our control. It's something we can do, and we can be ambitious. No one thought Woolton could do it. Nobody thought the Primrose League would do it. No one thinks you can create a modern mass movement nowadays. Oh, yes, you can. You just need to work out how and get on with it and have some effort, some spirit and some work. But we need policy too. And we worked out policy again, 45 to 51, and, as we've heard before, after 75. 45 to 51, it was Rab Butler. He came up with policies that made conservatism acceptable in an essentially socialist Britain, which was quite a clever thing to do. It wasn't red-blooded conservatism, but it had some greater freedoms than the socialists were willing to allow. Keith Joseph, we know, is so fundamentally important in what Margaret Thatcher went on to do, and in knowing what the principles were, what underpinned what we believed in, then became the detailed policies which could then be implemented. And this is where opposition is, in a funny way, refreshing, because government makes it very hard to think through, work through, implement new policies, because the minister is always being rushed off to some grand event. I mean, you see this with the poor Prime Minister immediately. He's straight off to the NATO summit. This makes it very hard to get on with deciding what policy should actually be when there are so many pressing and important distractions. But the policies we evolve must be based on our principles. And what are conservative principles? Well, we back the individual first. The individual before the state. We oppose the large state. We do not think the interests of the collective justify destroying an individual. That is crucial. We believe in the family. We believe that there is a tension between the family and the state, and that the state seeks to accrete power to itself, and the family is a bulwark against that. So we believe in the individual, the family, we believe in liberty. We believe, and this could have been said, was said, at meetings of the Primrose League, that we believe in our Constitution. And our Constitution has been ravaged, and Brexit begins to give us the ability to put it right, but it's not an ability we have used whilst we were in government. And what is our Constitution? Well, it's the rule of law. When I say the rule of law, it's the rule of the common law. The common law that has evolved since the reign of Henry II and underpins all our other freedoms. Our Constitution is based on freedom of speech within the common law, because that protects you from the corruption of bad lawyers or malevolent politicians. It's democracy. We need to be able to remove people. And one of the things I loved about being an MP, and particularly an MP for a county seat, not one of these new boy borough mongers, was that there is a continuity of representation of your county that predates 1265. That's when the boroughs came in. It's not when Parliament was established. The King had called Knights of the Shires before, and they came to represent their communities and seek redress of grievance. That antiquity of the origins of our democracy, and yes, look, it's not referendums all the time, but it brings the political nation close to the people. That is of such antiquity. It's fundamental to our Constitution. And, of course, the rights of property, which we were trampling over at the end of the last Conservative government, which was deeply shameful, and I opposed every effort to trample on the rights of property and entering into free contract. We need to have those four pillars of the Constitution. We need to restore the Constitution to the Dyson view of the sovereignty of Parliament. Why? Not because MPs and peers are great people, though they are, wonderful people, but because they represent you and me, ladies and gentlemen. They are there to ensure we are properly governed. So that is the challenge: the party structures, the opposition, and the policy that we need to have ready to implement. An opposition, in this sense, is a great opportunity. But we mustn't pretend that Thursday was not a disaster. And a reminder, a warning, an alarm bell against the arrogance of presumption that we thought we had a divine right to rule and a divine right to certain voters. We didn't. We thought our core vote had nowhere else to go. They did. And we cannot just assume that the pendulum will swing back to us, or that all the Reform voters will suddenly repent. We need to win them over, one way or another. But we should take heart from our history. A history of reinventing ourselves, a history of, as Dan Hannan said, being like Doctor Who, not a programme I've ever much liked, but there you go, of reinventing ourselves, coming back, even when we're out of office for long periods, recognising that there is value in conservatism, that it is popular, and that the name behind me is not an untruth. So, ladies and gentlemen, I don't say to you, go back to your constituencies and prepare for government. I say back to your constituencies and put ashes on your roses, because from the ashes of disaster grow the roses of success.
I'm getting very worried by the number of Doctor Who references, especially as a very large proportion of the electorate seemed absolutely determined to exterminate us last Thursday. We heard a little bit from Jacob there about structures that the party might need, and we've heard a lot about ideas and policy. But to consider the transformation of the party itself and how it should operate, I'm delighted to introduce our last speaker before we go to our panel discussion. A former member of the European Parliament, which means he knows inside the mind of Nigel Farage. True 18 certificate imagery there. He has become, our next speaker, a leading voice for the grassroots of the Conservative Party, and as chairman of CDO, a key proponent of party reform. Please give a very warm welcome to David Campbell-Bannerman. David.
Well, Mark, ladies and gentlemen, and the whole team at PopCon who've done a great job today in this much bigger chamber, thank you for inviting us along and for all the support you give CDO, the Conservative Democratic Organisation. I should just say up front, I'm very sorry that Liz Truss lost her seat. Obviously, she's very key to PopCon. I did help her. It was only 600 votes. I would point out that the so-called independent candidate, James Bagg, got 6,000 votes and had some very interesting company. He got the European movement to come up to support him, David Gauke, Dominic Grieve. So that's what they were up to. And all I can say is keep battling on, Liz, because you are a great voice for the battle of ideas on both sides of the Atlantic. And also to Jacob, obviously, who's another great loss, but obviously he's got multiple platforms, including GB News, and he'll be back. Now, funny enough, this election has referred a lot to 1906, and I'm rather conflicted over 1906 because a certain Sir Henry Campbell-Bannerman won for the Liberals. And Tunbridge Wells, actually, where I was brought up, it went Liberal in 1906 and it's gone Lib Dem now. So I would like to point out in his defence that his father was Conservative Mayor or Provost of Glasgow. So it does, you know, politics does change in families. We've touched on it here. It was a terrible result. I call it a Conservative Chernobyl. A sort of meltdown of Conservative. I can't believe that safe seats all disappeared during this election, and I suddenly found myself going around the country helping people in so-called safe seats because there were no safe seats, and also to concede halfway through the campaign that you've lost it. I've never known that. So it was a terrible campaign. They should have listened to Isaac Levido. I think he was overruled, according to the Times, by allegedly Dowden and those that knew better in number 10 to have an early election. Well, that did not work out so well. Just on Sunak, Rishi Sunak, I mean, clearly he's a hard-working, competent guy, but I don't believe, and I've been saying this for a year, I've been warning, that, you know, he doesn't play on the doorsteps. He's not a natural campaigner. He never actually really got involved in politics. He was never a councillor. He was sort of parachuted into North Yorkshire by William Hague and Globalists Unite. So I think the lesson in that, and it has been touched upon by others, that trust the membership to vote for leaders, because when you get someone like Sunak, who wasn't the second time round, no one voted for him, not even the MPs. It was a coronation. And Theresa May had a coronation as well, but when the members got a chance to vote, they voted for Cameron, and we got into government, and they voted for Boris. And, you know, people point at Liz Truss, they'll try and blame Liz Truss, but remember there was also, I think she's got great qualities, but there was also an anti-Sunak vote there. And that was, you know, ignored, and this is where we've been left. I think it's, you know, a serious fallout from that. But ladies and gentlemen, I'm not going to dwell too much on the campaign. The actual campaigning failures, I think, are fairly obvious. What I want to touch on today, because it's less obvious, is about candidates and candidate selection, because I've done a lot of research into this over 3 elections, probably mainly because I've been blocked from standing in 3 elections. But I mean, look, you know, I was lucky enough to be elected twice in the European Parliament. But what I want to say about candidate selection, I want you to know actually how it works, because it's symptomatic of everything that's gone wrong about our party, in my view. And I'm going to reveal the secrets of how Central Office fix candidate selection, so you know about this. And the first point is leave it as late as possible. You know, there were 160 candidates that were not selected when we hit the election. Now, Labour actually were well ahead of us, but Central Office regard this as an opportunity, not a threat. And why is that? Because they can bring in these things called emergency powers. And, you know, because of the pressures in the election, they can use emergency powers, which means they can actually boil down selections in safe seats, or previously safe seats, to just a choice of 3. And that's much easier to fix, which is their game, of course. Much easier to fix. You have your favoured candidate, and then you choose 2 token candidates, or maybe weaker candidates that aren't as strong in that area. And therefore, you make your favoured candidates look better. And that is the way they operate. You've also got the thing that they insist on the sift of CVs taking place in Central Office. Now, well, surely associations can do it themselves with a bit of oversight around the country. But no, they have to all traipse into Central Office and form an orderly queue. And you know, this is required. And why is that? Because then they can influence this sift. They often have their own pile of CVs that they favour, and they push those forward in this sift. And actually, if you speak to members who are involved in that, they say they are put under a lot of pressure. You know, if they're strong, they can stand up to it. But see, you know, Central Office has its favourites, and they use the sift process. But they've got you, actually, they've got you, because at the end of the day, thanks to Tony Blair and changing the law about elections, the nominating officer of the Conservative Party has ultimate power. You cannot be a Conservative candidate without the say-so of the nominating officer, and you can't call yourself Conservative candidate, you can't use a logo, you can't use a description, so you cannot be a Conservative candidate. And what this means, and there's a case, you know, Dan Hannan, and I'm so pleased he's in the Lords, he's a wonderful speaker and has done so much for Brexit, but he was in the running for Aldershot in 2017. This has been going on a long time. And if you remember, the Times reported on this, that the Aldershot Association was in Central Office saying, we want Dan Hannan. And they said, no, you can't have him. And they stopped it. And basically, if the association had carried on, they would have taken the power away from them. They take over the entire association. And then ultimately, the nominating officer decides who the candidate is. So they have ultimate power. There's a number of other ways that they fix things. And one of them is the way that you're categorized as a candidate. And there's some good people here, I know some of them, who have been turned away or been hit by some of these categories. Categories like deferrals and development, and, you know, more training is needed. I personally was deferred, which meant I could apply anywhere. I was on the comprehensive pass, except I could apply nowhere because the candidates committee blocked me from standing every 3 months. And, you know, if I wasn't nice about Rishi Sunak, that was his criteria, then they would keep the deferral in place. And ultimately it was too late to do anything about it. But I'm not alone. And I only raise it because there's so many good people that you don't know about who've been deferred this way. And this is a cop-out. All this, you know, why do people need all this training? I mean, I'm sure it, you know, central office probably actually gets a big budget for training all these people. But, you know, my local chairman of my local association, former chairman, you know, he was blocked from standing because they wanted him to do lots more training. Well, he's run an association, he's raised tens of thousands with the association, you know, he's become a councillor. How much training does he need? But this is all part of fixing things. And some very good candidates have been stopped. But again, this is about fixing. Why is it? Because they don't want good candidates getting in the way of those they prefer. You know, they use all these devices to stop people getting in the way because the last thing they want is a good local candidate or, you know, someone that can match their preferred choice. And I'm afraid the reality is that the selection procedure is corrupt. I don't use that word lightly, it is corrupt. And you have a self-serving cabal, a mafia, as a senior Tory put it, that is running this. And if you read Nadine Dorris's book, The Plot, and if you're interested in politics, please read it because it is revelatory and very serious. And in my experience, it is real, it's not fiction. You know, this is very, very serious. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was a focus on candidate selection, which in this election became, you know, very serious, including the excellent Lord Frost, you know, was caught up in this. And the point is, you know, that is unacceptable. So what are we going to do about it? So I'm just going to finish by giving you what CDO is putting forward about party reform. And we call it the 7 steps. We're going to ask every leadership candidate to sign up to the 7 steps, to sign up to a new constitution, which John Strafford has been mentioned. He's helped write that. We've got a working team that's put that together. We've got it nearly ready to go for the leadership candidates. And we want to clear out central office. We have a plan. They stopped mentioning the plan. Well, we've got a plan. So, ladies and gentlemen, the 7 steps, very briefly. Firstly, we want an elected party chairman. Now, why do you have an elected party chairman? Because an elected party chairman will represent you, Conservatives, to the leader, not the leader to you, not be a patsy to the leader. And this is very relevant because in 2017, I mean, I asked Patrick McLaughlin, the former chairman, I said, is it true you weren't consulted about the general election being called by Theresa May? And he said, yep, that is true. And he said, well, he said to the Prime Minister, had you consulted me, I would advise you not to do it. And he would have been right. But that is how low the esteem is from someone who's just a patsy of the Prime Minister. But if they're an elected leader, or elected chairman, then they have a lot more power and stature. And we wanted we want an AGM, we want annual meetings, and we want the head of candidates to be elected as well, to present a report about candidates and how they're getting on. And if they're not good enough, then fire them. So electing is important. The second point, party constitution. We want 1 member, 1 vote through this AGM. I think that's very important. And you can amend the constitution with a 60% majority. Third point, which is what we've been touching on, constituency associations should have the rights to determine who their candidates are. And they should be able to choose an MP and to get rid of an MP, to deselect them too. And central office should have a very minor role in this, apart from eliminating the sad, mad and bad. You know, that is really what their role is, a quality control check, basic checks before you get to that point. They should not be in the business of fixing everything to the detriment of many good candidates. The fourth point is the spring conference, which is a grudge conference, March, where, you know, nothing much happens. There's a convention, but we want to turn it into a policy conference where ministers, or shadow ministers now, will come along and listen to members about their policy ideas. There's no commitment, but they will listen. Now, policy matters, as I'm sure you'll know. CPC, I got involved in policy, and that's how I sort of got into conservative associations. So a policy conference, I think, will to re-energize. Remember the old conferences of old where you had these amazing debates and they printed all the associations, all the resolutions they had and all sorts of policy. All of that's gone. It's like a sales conference now, party conference, and you get people back. The party conference, by the way, should be run more by volunteers, not for money, not in expensive places. CDO had a conference in Bournemouth, which went really well. I love Bournemouth. What a great place to have a conference. Let's go back to Bournemouth, shall we? Sixthly, election of party leader, again being touched upon. It is important, but this should be within the main constitution. You've got the 1922 committee with some strange powers. You know, at one point, by the way, in 2016, you only needed a proposer and a seconder to stand for leader. Last time, it was 100 MPs you needed. And these are the same rules that get moved around by the 22. So it should be part of the main constitution. And finally, we need a constitutional commission to look at all of this. And I think that is well overdue. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's our 7-step reform with a new constitution, the detail of it, and we're working on this plan for central office, you know, so watch this space. So thank you for listening, and please do support CDO. It's on the website, and thank you again, Popcons, for this excellent conference. Thank you. Yes.
I would like to thank all our speakers so far today, but this would not be a grassroots group without the grassroots having some involvement. Some of you have already sent in questions, but get your thinking caps on whilst we just set up and ask away for the issues that matter to you, the things you think need to change, the things you have seen, understood, and know the Conservatives could do better. I will not reintroduce the panel. They have all given us wonderful thoughts already today. Andrew Allinson from Popular Conservatism also joining us. But please do put your thinking caps on, and we will take questions from the floor. Right, now, I'm blinded. Over to the left. If we could get a microphone to the gentleman.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased I stayed to the end to hear some of your comments about candidate selection, because I've had the privilege for the last 20 years to help to coach candidates who were going forward. And I very much see the problems. This time round, we had a situation where the same people who ran the ship onto the rocks reserved the places in the lifeboat for themselves. And it was an appalling failure of leadership, a really nauseating spectacle to start the election off with. And how can we claim to promote meritocracy when we're running a matocracy ourselves in the selection of candidates? So there are a couple of things I'd like to add to the list that David came up with of suggestions. First one is, I'd like to see...
I'm going to have to interrupt you. This is absolutely wonderful. Please
All right.
do feed in, but we are so tight on time. The questions are going to have to be short and snappy.
Absolutely. Do you agree that we should scrap the emergency selection procedure and replace it with a do-your-job procedure where CCHQ fill the roles as they become available? Because it's always abused.
Thank you. And also there's a gentleman just in front. Can you see just in the green?
Thank you.
Could you give your name as
Sorry,
well?
my name is Andrew McHugh. I'm the Treasurer of the North Oxfordshire Conservative Association. Really, this is a question for Dr. Starkey. We've had a lot about history today. In 325, the early Christian church had a Council of Nicaea, which came up with the Nicene Creed. Is it time for us as conservatives to have a similar conference to actually define what real conservatism means?
Thank you very much. And perhaps if we could get a microphone to this gentleman in the front here. If you could just give your name and where you're from.
Richard Leader, Chelsea, soon to be New York in about 5 minutes' time. And as the answer, I'll keep it very, very brief. Can we please, please, please not rush the leadership election? It's so, so darned important. We shouldn't just bowl in there and install whoever comes to hand. Let's please take our time with it. Thank you.
Right. I think if our panel can start with those three. Perhaps if we start at the end, and Andrew, would you like to share your views on the leadership election?
Yeah, the leadership election. I totally agree. We do have to take our time on that. I think there are some elements of, well, shall we call them the wets, on the left of the Conservative Party would rather like to rush it and would rather like to put their candidate in and in some ways fix it. And I'm sure David Campbell-Bannerman will speak on this, the idea that members will have the right to vote on the leadership being taken away from them. So I think there's all sorts of things going on. I believe that the chairman of the 1922 committee is being elected this evening, but I think that the executive is getting elected next week. At least that's what I read yesterday. So if it's inaccurate, blame the media.
And perhaps Starkey, David Starkey, you would be happy to answer Anthony's question on the Nicaea Council.
Yes, forgive me, I do really think that we need very much investigation of what is conservatism. I began with a very serious proposal. We simply circulate Margaret Thatcher's lecture. We simply circulate that lecture. It is all you need. As I said, it would need a kind of fashionably called executive summary at the beginning. It would need possibly a postscript in which one looked at why straying from it had been so catastrophic, and also, as it were, tying to specific problems now. Can I just go back, however, to the question that you've just answered now, this entire issue of popular involvement in the party. Jacob was absolutely spot on. It is not simply that the idea of popular involvement in politics on a sustained scale is invented by the Conservative Party in the 1880s. It is Disraeli who first recognizes that the ordinary man, as it was then, is patriotic, is a worthy recipient of the ballot, the Great Reform Act of 1867, which is the genuine beginning of democracy in Britain. There are earlier forms of representative government, but actually a mass electorate is the creation of the Conservative Party. We have to recover that. We've also got to recognize there is a deliberate conspiracy against the notion of democracy. Democracy is now a dirty word. Have you noticed democracy is Greek, which is, we all love it, but we have this strange notion democracy is about the protection of minorities. I thought it was about rule by the majority. How had I got it wrong? There's also, the moment you put democracy, which just means the rule of the people, into Latin, and you say populist, it suddenly becomes a dirty word. We are going to have to recover. And I think the future is on our side. I am absolutely, this is what we are forgetting. Starmer's government will fail. It will fail because it's a contradiction. It says it can bring about growth through regulation. This is a nonsense. It will fail on the grounds of contradiction. It will fall into our lap, providing we've acknowledged the basic truth that the elites are them, we represent and are genuinely popular. We've lost that. We have to recover it.
And perhaps, Mark, you might be willing to expand on how candidate selection can be made more of a meritocracy.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think there is some sort of role for central office here, right? I mean, there probably does need to be some approved list of candidates. If you want to be a Conservative candidate, I don't know, you've got to go through criminal records check, that kind of thing. Some sort of check that you haven't said anything absolutely outrageous or been involved in crime in some way. But then, what maddened me was that seats that could have selected many, many moons ago and could have had a candidate in place, whoever he or she may be, who then built up their name recognition in that constituency over the past year or so, seemed to me to be deliberately held back to allow the emergency procedure to trip in. Absolutely extraordinary. So when a seat becomes vacant, the party should, and central office should, try and encourage the association to select as soon as possible. But it needs to be an open contest. I mean, let's be honest, the particularly egregious one, we've spoken a lot about the rule of three, was that Basildon and Billericay would put forward a shortlist of one. I mean, this is positively North Korean. I've never met Richard Holden. I don't know what he's like as an MP, but this is absolutely extraordinary. So there needs to be a much firmer rule that there will be open selection as soon as we know that the seat is vacant and get the name recognition for the candidate. Just one very quick point on Richard's thing about the leadership. I am minded to say don't rush it as well. I think if we kick off the contest immediately and have two candidates going forward to the membership in a fortnight's time, that's probably not the right environment for it. But there are some quite serious trade-offs here. I mean, the Labour government's first budget is going to be in September. And I think, are going to need to muster some pretty serious opposition to that. So I think I'm going to answer Richard's question with what David Frost suggested earlier. Might it be worthwhile to put in an interim leader for, let's say, the next 6, 8, 9, 12 months, something of that sort of length? Not the current leader, not the deputy leader, an interim leader who would not be a candidate in the subsequent election, but can ensure that we can muster some opposition to this Labour government from day one, rather than delaying it for 6 months until our leadership election is complete.
I'm going to just take more and I'll come to you.
Yeah. Yes, I just on the last point first about the leadership, I worry that I don't want to get too far away from this disaster because I think certain MPs, especially on the left, rival David Starkey on rewriting history. And Finkelstein of the Times and others are already at it, you know, trying to blame Liz Truss and it's all Brexit and Boris and all of this, when it really wasn't. So I'm happy to have it sort of, you know, by the party conference. I think we have to get on with it. I don't think we need 6 weeks. I don't think we need 6 weeks of hustings like last time. It can be compressed. We know who these people are. We know broadly where we are. On the other point the gentleman made, and it's relevant to Basildon and Billericay, emergency measures have two strands to them. The first one is a short list of 3, but actually in the last 48 hours, that can come down to 1, which is exactly what they use to get Richard Holden accepted or selected by Basil and Billericay. And what happened then, allegedly, is all the activists went off and helped other seats. So that's why he got a majority of 20, and he was lucky to get a majority of 20. But that seat was actually made available in October last year when John Barron stood down, exactly Mark's point. And why was it held back? And who decided to hold it back? Like a sort of a couple of cards, and the various other seats were affected as well. And that is a disgrace, and there should be an inquiry into that, and I'm glad he's gone, frankly.
Right, if I could take another 3 questions. If we could go to Lance, and maybe if we could get a microphone to this gentleman here, and the lady here afterwards. If you can give your name and whereabouts you're from, that would be great.
Thank you very much, Annunziata Lance Foreman. Nigel Farage made a very pertinent observation in the last week of campaign, and he said that the Tory party claimed to be a broad church, but without a religion. And he's absolutely right. You know, we have people in our party that want to frack. There are other people in the party that believe in climate catastrophe. It can't work. There's a very interesting book called Good to Great, which talks about how organizations become great organizations. And what it says is before they start working out what it is they're going to be, you know, marketing, selling, and so on, the first thing they have to do is work out who should be on the bus and who they need to get off the bus. The question I have is, are we so divided that we need to get people off the bus rather than try and hold everybody together with a party that's just divided?
And your name and whereabouts you're from too, please.
Thank you. Andre from South Islington. Do our speakers agree that a primary reason for the Conservative loss is party disunity? Setting up readyforrishi.com in December 2021, the leaking and scheming by MPs like Michael Gove and even Kemi Badenoch encouraging cabinet members in WhatsApp groups to resign from Johnson's government.
Thank you very much. And the lady just here.
Thank you very much. No, I was just quite interested seeing how the results came in on the night and the results of the Liberal Democrats. And actually, today, obviously, we've been talking very much about the reform movement and how we take that position on the right. But I was looking throughout the campaign, and it was quite difficult being on the doorstep to remind people that actually Conservatism needs to be compassionate, caring Conservatives. And particularly when the Liberal Democrats got their results, thinking about their policies on social care, just how we're going to prove to people that we are caring, compassionate Conservatives, really aware of those things, those real things that are really hurting people, the long waiting lists, the difficulties seeing doctors, and social care packages, particularly for people that need extra support. So that's something I'd be really interested in, well, with hopefully popular conservatism to exist. I think that that message of caring, compassionate Conservatives needs to really come through.
Thank you. And if I could have one more. The gentleman at the back, if we've got a microphone.
My name is Dr. Derek Morris. I came in from California to make Britain the new Greater Britain. I've submitted pages of policies to the committee. I think it's useless. We need to get rid of that. I'm the man that helped President Obama run the United States. All his policies were mine, except gays, smoking weed, and health care. I would like to be a part of this leadership committee to get the policies out there that will bring us back into power very quick.
Thank you very much. Perhaps, David Starkey, you might want to start on the compassion of conservatism.
Every time I hear the word compassion, I want to reach for a revolver. I hate the worship of victimhood. I hate the worship of the weak. I'm sorry, we've really got to say this. Hayek is absolutely right. The welfare state is the road to serfdom. Welfarism is incompatible with freedom and economic success. It really is. It is also leading directly to budget collapse, inflation, and the loss of confidence in our currencies. And this fact will be driven home. This fact will be driven home by the catastrophic failure of this incoming government. In other words, I'm sorry, I understand. Again, let me use brutal terms. Woke is essentially a form of female caring gone wrong. It is a parody of Christianity's concern for the weak. It is Nietzsche's parody view of Christianity, and it is catastrophic. The way we look after the poor is by making the rest of us rich. It's very, very simple. Not all the welfare in the world has taken people out of poverty. It is this. The Middle Ages was built on an idea of charity. Most people, apart from a handful, were desperately poor. It's the astonishing multiplication of wealth that came from freedom and capitalism and enterprise that has lifted not simply the poor in England, but the poor throughout the world. If you look in China, if you look in India, if you look in Southeast Asia, they have risen not because of foreign aid, that wonderful, which again is yet another idiot form of compassion. As my former colleague at LSE, Peter Bauer, said, it is taking money from poor people in rich countries and giving it to rich people in poor countries. What has lifted them out, what has lifted the world out of poverty is freedom of enterprise, freedom of thought. And do you know what? These things do carry also fundamental forms of social responsibility. Real charity, the extraordinary activity of the great Victorians, the men who'd built the vast fortunes, the Cadburys, the Rowntrees, and so on. That is what we should be looking for. And of course, Labour and disgracefully, shockingly Cameron effectively statized, took over charity. We need to recover this wonderful thing that the English-speaking people gave to the world in 1601 with the Charitable Causes Act. So, sorry, we've got to alter the narrative. You see, so again, the moment you use the word compassion, the moment you talk about that wetsuited idiot whose real contribution to public life is the post office scandal, Ed Davey, the moment you start using his language, we've lost. We've got to take control of the language. Sorry.
Mark, perhaps you would like to address the question of whether the Conservatives are a broad church with no religion.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it's not so much a broad church as a massive cathedral, isn't it? I mean, broader than the broadest of churches. And listen, I touched on it earlier. What should be the sort of criteria that we look for in Conservative parliamentary candidates? And perhaps there should be a role for central office in this regard with regard to political beliefs. Not how many diversity training courses have you gone through, not how many in-touch leaflets have you delivered at a by-election, but candidates should be asked, who is your favourite economist? And if the answer isn't Hayek or Friedman, then you're not making it onto the list, would be my view. Adam Smith, I'll allow in Adam Smith as well. That's about as broad church as I go. So, we should be broad church. We should allow both the Austrian school and the Chicago School of Economics to live happily side by side with each other in the Conservative and Unionist Party. But one of my biggest worries is a good number of Conservative candidates and Conservative MPs would probably give the answer Keynes, or possibly even Marx. That is too broad church. So I think that we need to test out the beliefs of our candidates, not just their perceived competency through some weird training programme. That would be a useful function that the central party could perform.
David, perhaps you would like to answer Craig's question.
Yeah, I think you're referring to the WhatsApp with Kemi saying go, go, go to the other ministers. Is that what you refer? Yeah. It's actually one of the CDO lords, Lord Greenhow of London. He was deputy mayor with Boris. He put that out, and it does show a very childish behaviour where she's encouraging other ministers to resign to bring down Boris. And I think that's pretty shameful, actually, and will be held against her in this leadership battle. Do you want me to respond to Lance? Or, Lance, nice to see you here. I was just going to say, it's interesting, like Broadchurch, etc., and how we work together. There's a wider issue about how we work together. I'm thinking at the moment that we might end up where we did in the referendum, which is you have, the same aims, Reform and us, but we go about it in different ways. And Nigel is so good at the grassroots, which is what the Go movement did in the referendum. And, Conservatives are better at parliamentary experience and, that sort of level. So we might end up kind of working together. And I think talk of any merger, whatever, is premature. And, I know Nigel actually did the right thing in 2019, and he got a lot of grief for it, for pulling out in order to get Brexit done. And I respect that, and I don't think we just rush into deals, because that's unfair on Nigel and Richard Tice. I think working together in some kind of harmony would be good, and see what happens next.
If we could get a microphone, please, to the gentleman there, and this lady in the blue jacket, and the gentleman here after that.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to ask a last question. My name's John May. I've been active in the east of England in getting us out of the European Union, and for the record, I was also at Kemi Badenoch's adoption meeting, and have to say categorically that what Nadine Dorris said in her book is completely false, and therefore colours my perception of the work of fiction that a lot of the rest of that book is. However, I would like to ask Mark and the panel something, picking up on the fact that there needs to be a two-stage process, because I think what we've heard today, and it's great to hear the conversation being about what went wrong and what needs to go right. I have a business background, and to my mind, the Conservative Party is very close to a business that's gone politically bust. And for that reason, is it the view that the first thing we need to do is to fix what's wrong before we can appoint a chief executive who's actually going to get the company, if that's the right analogy, back to a stage where in 5 years' time, people will consider voting for it and buying what the Conservative Party has to offer?
Thank you. And, Madam?
Caroline Strafford from Beaconsfield. Could we agree that everyone working at CCHQ is a member of the Conservative Party? We were told by a deputy chairman of the party that a director voted Lib Dem at the previous general election, not the last one. So let's clear out the Lib Dems.
And it was this gentleman here, if we've got a microphone. And if we can keep them quite short, we've only got about 8 minutes left. We will get through as many as we possibly can.
Thank you very much. Simon Forthorpe, councillor from Bromley, the only free speech council in the country. And we are leading the way at a local level. And I just wonder from the panel, what else can we do at a local level to lead the way and show that conservatism can work?
Thank you, and this gentleman.
Yeah, my name's Andre Camilleri, and I'm a county councillor from Nottinghamshire, Mansfield in Nottinghamshire. the hotbed of reform. Just going back to the leadership, if we leave the leadership for 6 or 8 months, that will take us into county council elections, and we'll get whitewashed at the elections, especially where I am, in Mansfield and Ashfield. Reform is strong there. I've already been contacted to join them. They're looking for people like me to organise and get ready. Now, if we dither about and don't get the job done, because that's what we're good at, talking about not getting the job done, we'll get whitewashed at next year's county council elections, and we'll have nobody to speak up for us anyway. Thank you. And what would you do? What would you suggest that we do to counteract the reform problem?
Perhaps if we start with the last first. Andrew, would you like to address the timings again, but with reference to the very important county council elections? We also have them where I live in Lincolnshire, and I know this is a big concern for many people.
Yeah, as in what is going to happen next year and countering reform. Yeah. Well, I think what the Conservative Party has got to be is conservative again. It really is as simple as that. I mean, Caroline Strafford made an excellent point. You know, I mean, in Parliament we've had a parliamentary party that would be much more at home with the Liberal Democrats or with the Blairites. They're simply not conservative. And of course, if you cast your mind back to late 2005, a certain David Cameron was elected leader of the Conservative Party. He came up with his A-list. He came up with all sorts of candidates that he wanted to push forward to try and present the Conservative Party as being a broad church. And they simply weren't conservative. I didn't recognise them as conservatives, and it's hardly surprising that the party has got itself into this situation. So I heard, I think it was Mark's speech right at the very beginning, where he said that nature abhors a vacuum, and certainly that applies to politics. And I'm afraid, you know, when the Conservative Party decided to stop being conservative, it just left the pitch, allowed reform to take its place. And it's hardly surprising that we are where we are.
Mark, John asked if we were a political party, it looks like we're going bust, should we fix the company before getting a new CEO?
It's an interesting analogy, John. Good to see you. But I actually think that it's the job of the new CEO to fix the company. I don't think you put it, that's the way round it needs to be. I want to hear from the leadership candidates whenever they emerge, whoever they might be, what is their plan to fix the company? We haven't gone bust, but, you know, our share price has fallen through the floor, right? And it's not obvious that how much lower it could go. So it seems to me the point of the leadership election is to find the leader who can turn this tank around. And that's what they should be held to account for. They will need a number of other skills as well, good parliamentary performers, good on television, that sort of thing, good policy thinker. But the urgency now is to find a leader who can stem the bleeding and rehabilitate the patient. It was put to me by one journalist that we're not so much looking for a new leader of the party, we're looking for a necromancer who can bring something back from the dead. And I'm extremely interested in working out who that person might be. I genuinely don't know at this stage, but that needs to be front and centre. Again, on the timing of the leadership election, I mean, I just wonder whether we should straddle party conference. That we've got, you know, although we have a diminished number of MPs, we have a reasonable number of newly elected MPs who won't know their more established colleagues particularly well. I'm not sure I'd want to force them into a decision in the course of the next 2 or 3 weeks. Why could the parliamentary party not vote upon our return to Westminster in September, put forward 2 candidates to the membership, have those 2 candidates do a husting at Conservative Party conference, put the ballot papers out about then, and have the new leader in place when conference season ends, there or thereabouts? That seems to me a pretty sensible way of doing it.
I think I am just going to quickly move on to the last questions I'll be taking. If they can be very quick, that would be amazing. If we could bring a microphone to the lady here and gentleman there. And I just saw a hand that I've now lost. And the gentleman on the first row of the back.
Is it my turn? Hello. Hi, my name's Laura Weldon. I was the parliamentary candidate for Pontefract, Castleford and Nottingley at the last elections. Obviously, a lot of people in this room are volunteers for the party, activists, and that seems to have been missing from the discussion today about how our volunteers and activists are treating. I was on a call shortly after the local elections where a now disgraced senior party figure threatened to put the screws on candidates in terms of activism after the local elections. We've had similar sort of threats and nonsense about whether or not we should be campaigning in seats like mine where we're not expected to win. What can we do about that? Because that is the way that we are losing our support that will help us to actually physically win the elections, as well as the voters and the theory about why we're Conservatives in the first place.
Thank you very much.
Angus Allen, Colchester, we had one of the worst results in the country. There's two topics that we haven't discussed. One is competence and the other is Boris Johnson. Was he the worst Prime Minister we've ever had?
Thank you very much. And there's the gentleman at the back there.
Thank you. Councillor Roger Bird, Fareham. All of you on the platform have, over the years, published articles and policy papers about exactly where the party could go next. Many of us here in the room, I'm sure, have some great ideas that could help take forward the policy agenda and principles which PopCon has. Will PopCon also be a forum through which we can publish these ideas and get them in front of the next leader, whoever that may be?
And actually, the gentleman just there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am Sam Akake, an immigrant from Uganda. Ministers have told us over the years that foreign aid is working to tackle poverty. If so, why are migrants voting with their feet and coming this way in their thousands every year in search of a better life?
Thank you very much. Perhaps, Mark, if we could start with, will Popular Conservatism be a forum for all the supporters and members and Conservatives across the country to feed in their ideas?
Yeah, Roger, it's an interesting point, and I don't want to say no. I don't want to say no. But when I left the IEA to set up this group, it wasn't my view that what centre-right politics desperately needed was yet another policy think tank in Westminster. There are quite a few. But the pledge I will make, and I think we've made a good start today, is we want to bring together the genuine grassroots of the party to share ideas about policy, strategy and structure. We will continue to do that. I am very conscious that since our big initial meeting, we have only moved about 50 yards in a slightly southwest direction from the room that was there to the room that was here. So the other thing that we would like to do, possibly over the summer, definitely into the autumn, is some sort of roadshow to get out into the country and meet people and canvass ideas. And I'm open to the suggestion that we should actually build policy competence as well. I just wanted to take this question about the central planning and threat to candidates. The bit we've got to flip in our structure isn't just the constitution of the party, but it's a mentality. Basically, our analysis of what goes wrong in Britain is central planning and a big state. So why do we practice that ourselves as a political party? All of our economic analysis is that people closer to the ground know what to do best. You know how better to spend your money than a government bureaucrat does, but we don't seem to apply that to our own structures. So we've got to flip that around. And CCHQ, or whatever replaces it, needs to be a service centre for the voluntary party, not a command and control central planning centre for the overall party.
We're now running over time, so David Starkey, incredibly short and punchy, if you can. We hadn't discussed competence or Boris. Was he the worst Prime Minister ever, historically speaking?
No, but the office of Prime Minister is one of extraordinary difficulty. You've got to have big picture, which Boris could, but also minute grasp of detail, which he didn't. And finally, you've had a certain steadiness, work ethic, and sense of public responsibility, all of which are 1,000 miles from him, despite the fact that he's one of the best educations in the world. Can I just quickly come to what I think is the key thing we should be taking away from this? We've heard a lot about party organisation. We've heard a lot about candidate selection. We've heard a lot about, if you like, Tory philosophy. What we need to see at every level of the party, its MPs, its constituency organisations, its student organisations, the lot. We should recognise we're about having fun, we're about ambition, which, contrary to Nolan, I think is a very good thing, but above all, it's an educational thing. We need to be learning ourselves, we need to be teaching others, and it's something that is profoundly satisfying and profoundly worthwhile, and we have failed at miserably, which is why the left has captured public discourse. We need to be popular, but we need to recover that great mission of popular education.
We are desperately out of time. I think it has been extremely useful for everyone up here to hear from all of you, as I hope it was for all of you to have heard from everyone here. There are a lot of takeaways from today. There is no ability to gloss over quite how profound a change we are going to have to go through. We abandoned not only our voters, but our members. I thank you all for standing by us, because I'm not sure we deserved it. I think our leadership let every single one of us down, and they let our country down. We have heard from the speakers today of the philosophy, the values that we need to reclaim as our own because they are conservative values. We have heard about the failures of CCHQ, bullying candidates, choosing inappropriate people for seats that didn't want them, railroading volunteers into doing their bidding not successfully. We have heard about the opposition creating a vacuum, our policies non-existent. Our leadership let all of that happen. The rot has been growing for a long time. But as Jacob said, from the ashes of disaster grow the roses of success, and with all of you here and all of your networks across the country, we can and we will rebuild a successful Conservative future. The future is bright and the sun might come out when we win. Thank you all very much.
Everybody loses it. Everybody wants to throw it all away someday.
And he agreed with the place now in February. And can you speak actually there?
Thanks everybody for joining us. Minister Chambers and Minister Donoghue are here for John Canal, Assistant Secretary of Expenditure, and John Carr. The other start John with a short presentation, then we'll move to the ministers and then we'll take questions.
Okay, thanks, Deb. Okay, so I'll provide a brief overview of the document. As everybody here is aware, what we're setting out today really are the macro fiscal parameters for Budget 2025 without identifying the individual policy instruments. So I can be very brief then on the economic backdrop, maybe too brief. Okay, just in terms of the external situation then, the graph on the left shows IMF forecasts for Ireland's major trading partners. In green is the sort of historical norm for both the US, UK and Euro area, and in gold then you see the forecasts for this year. Really it's a case of the US leading and the UK and Euro area lagging. So, I mean, that does raise some issues for the indigenous sector of the economy, etc., given the importance of the UK as an external market. The graph on the right-hand side then shows the 5-year forecast from the IMF for the global economy. I think the key takeaway here is that if you look beyond the short term, the growth rate for 2029 is the 5-year ahead forecast is the lowest it has ever been for the global economy. And that really reflects issues like demographics, trade frictions, deglobalisation, those sort of issues that we have been identifying within the department. On the prices front then, somebody move on the next slide. Okay, thank you. Key point here is that the pace of disinflation in major trading partners has been really fast, I guess faster than would have been anticipated. So in all regions, inflation is now running at about 2%, having been in excess of 10% in some regions as recently as 2 years ago. And this really reflects the impact of monetary policy tightening. which really has been the most aggressive pace of tightening really in a generation. I kind of think about it as the kind of the 3 S's: the speed, the scale and the synchronisation of monetary policy tightening. So what does that mean then for the domestic economy? Okay, the graph on the left shows inflation in Ireland, and I think the key takeaway here, we elaborate a little bit on this in the document itself, is that the first round effects from the energy price shock have now unwound. Inflation at the moment is running at 1.5%. About 2 years ago, it was running at 9.5%. And I think it's fair to say the evidence of second-round effects, so kind of wage price spirals, etc., really has diminished at this stage. And if you look at the graph in blue, you can see that core inflation is now just 2.3%, its lowest level again in about 2 years. So essentially what that means is that real wages, real take-home pay, real incomes, etc., are now in positive territory for the first time since mid-2021, and this is supporting consumer spending and modified domestic demand, which is the graph on the right, where you can see it grew by 1.5% in the first quarter of the year. One really noticeable feature of the post-pandemic recovery really has been the labour market. Graph on the left shows employment growth in Ireland from just before the pandemic to now, and it compares it with every other euro area country, as well as the US and the UK. Total employment in Ireland is up by 340,000 over that period, an increase of 14%. Only Malta is stronger. I actually don't know what's going on in Malta, but Ireland really is an outlier there. Graph on the right then shows unemployment, and it shows unemployment relative to its historical norm. So the shaded area is the historical norm, so the min-max over 20 years leading up to the pandemic. The circle then is unemployment right now. And despite the most aggressive tightening of monetary policy, you can see that unemployment in practically every country is close to its lowest level ever. In Ireland, the latest figure is 4.3% for the first quarter of this year. Okay, moving then to the fiscal situation, just want to highlight the issues on corporate tax. You'll have heard us talk about this on many occasions. This is the share of total corporate tax that comes from the top 10 firms. A decade and a half ago, about 15% came from 10 companies. Last year, over half came from 10 companies. Maybe a better way of looking at it is the graph on the right, which shows that which shows the amount of total tax coming from 10 companies. So if you look at this in 2008, for instance, €1 in every 45 euros came from 10 companies. Last year, €1 in every 7 that the state took in came from 10 companies. So there is a big concentration risk that needs to be noted. Okay, coming to the end, just in terms of the budgetary strategy then that the two ministers are setting out today, the key objectives and trade-offs. The key objective really is to continue to address the infrastructural deficit, especially on the housing front, to provide more health spending with some conditionality, and that's set out in a box in the document. There's more health spending for both this year and for next year. To continue to support households and firms in a context of where consumer prices have risen by around a fifth over the past couple of years. And then to provide more public service in the context of a situation where the population has increased quite dramatically and where the number of people in employment has increased quite dramatically. The trade-offs need to obviously avoid overheating the economy, to reduce the reliance on corporate tax, etc., and that's why the Minister has established the Future Ireland Fund and the ICNF, but also to prepare as well then for the medium-term challenges, what we call the 4Ds. So then in terms of the overall package then, government is making available €8.3 billion by way of tax and spending for next year. Decisions already made. Government is providing for €5.1 billion to meet existing levels of service, as well as decisions already made. The breakdown of that is government is providing $1.5 billion for additional spending for health this year and $1.2 billion next year on an ELS, on an existing level of service basis. The public sector pay deal, the carryover effect of that costs $1.2 billion next year. There are several policy announcements that have a full year cost next year amounting to $1.3 billion, and NDP spending amounts to $1.4 billion. New measures then government is providing for new current spending amounting to $1.8 billion and an overall tax package of $1.4 billion. I'll skip the risks there in the interest of time and just conclude. I won't go through the numbers again, just to say that the numbers beyond 2025 are purely technical assumptions in the document. There will be a new government that covers the period 26 to 30, and they will set the fiscal parameters. We will update our economic and fiscal forecasts in the autumn as part of the budget, as we always do, and there's a new EU legal requirement to submit a medium-term fiscal plan in October. Thanks, Deb. I'll hand over to the Minister.
Thanks, Deb, and thanks, John, and good afternoon to you all. In a few moments, I'll outline the key points of the Summer Economic Statement, which sets out the fiscal parameters within Budget 25 and upon which it will be delivered. The last number of years have been defined by a series of successive major economic shocks. Indeed, perhaps the most important lesson of the past few years is that the world is becoming more shock-prone. Most recently in Ireland, along with almost all other advanced economies, we have grappled with the effects of multi-decade high rates of inflation and the related rapid rise in interest rates. Despite these headwinds, our businesses and our people have shown incredible resilience in the face of adversity, and the Irish economy has weathered these shocks remarkably well. Our commitment to supporting households and businesses through these shocks has been reflected in the scale of support we've provided to assist with the cost of living challenge. The budgetary measures we have taken over recent years have helped to ensure the underlying strength of our economic fundamentals, and this is most clearly evident in the labour market, with a record number of people in employment and an unemployment rate of just 4.2% in June. By any reasonable estimate, we are now at full employment. Therefore, at the current juncture, supply is the main constraint to growth. The cost of living pressures faced by households over recent years are undeniable. At its peak, inflation was increasing by close to 10% on an annual basis. Fortunately, we've made significant progress since then, and inflationary pressures have now dissipated, with inflation at just 1.5% in June, the lowest rate since April 2021. Against this backdrop, growth in the domestic economy is expected to gather momentum as the year progresses. Indeed, modified domestic demand is expected to grow by close to 2% this year, with a further pickup in growth next year. The Summer Economic Statement does highlight that risks remain on the horizon, with the most pressing risks external in origin. The potential escalation of conflicts around the world, geopolitical tensions and the further fragmentation of global trade all have the potential to have a disruptive impact on the Irish economy. At the headline level, our public finances are performing well. Significant budgetary surpluses are in prospect over the coming years. However, the headline fiscal position masks the underlying vulnerabilities present in our public finances. In particular, our public finances remain highly exposed to volatile corporation tax revenue. My department estimates that around half of total corporate tax receipts are potentially windfall in nature and therefore cannot be relied upon to fund permanent spending commitments. Indeed, on an underlying basis, that is, excluding windfall corporation tax receipts, a deficit is in prospect again this year. It is against this economic and fiscal backdrop that Budget 25 will be framed, this government's fifth and final financial statement. And in the Summer Economic Statement 2021, the government set out a medium-term budgetary strategy that was based on public expenditure growth of 5% per year, in line with the trend growth rate of the economy. In order to provide for increased capital expenditure and further investment in our public services in the context of a rapidly growing population, Government has decided to adjust this strategy. In that respect, on Tuesday, the 1st of October, Minister Donoghue and I will present a budget that provides for an overall package of €8.3 billion. This package will be composed of additional spending amounting to €6.9 billion and taxation measures amounting to €1.4 billion. At the time of the Stability Programme update, my department projected a general government surplus of €9.7 billion next year. The revised fiscal parameters set out in the Summer Economic Statement will be consistent with a surplus of just under €6 billion next year. This compares to a surplus of €8.3 billion last year and a projected surplus of just over €7 billion this year. My department will publish an updated set of macroeconomic and fiscal projections with the budget in October. In relation to taxation, a key objective of policy in Budget 25 will once again be to help avoid a situation where workers and other income taxpayers end up paying a higher percentage of their income as their earnings grow. In relation to spending, overall spending will now increase by 6.9% next year. A package of this size strikes a balance. It provides government with the scope to enhance our public infrastructure and improve public services while maintaining the long-term sustainability of the public finances. Minister Donoghue will discuss the expenditure package in more detail. It is of course important to stress that additional financial resources must go hand in hand with mechanisms that improve public service delivery. Indeed, value for money considerations must once again come to the fore, and an increased focus on efficiency and productivity is needed. Additionally, there is a need for a better medium-term plan in terms of the public finances here in Ireland and across the EU. And this is particularly important given the recent reforms to the EU fiscal framework. These reforms mean that government must produce a medium-term fiscal plan for the first time in the autumn, setting out the medium-term pathway for the public finances. Once endorsed by the Council of the EU, this will commit us to a binding net expenditure path over a 5-year period. In general, there will not be scope to alter this plan unless a new government takes office. This will involve a sea change in how budgetary policy is conducted in Ireland. Given Ireland's favourable fiscal position at present, we will not receive a formal binding fiscal constraint from the European Commission. As such, the formulation of an appropriate medium-term expenditure strategy will need to take heed of the macroeconomic environment, whilst also considering a sustainable path of the delivery of short-term priorities and the longer-term needs of our economy and society. Included in those considerations are the significant structural challenge facing our economy, the megatrends comprising of the so-called 4Ds, demographics, decarbonisation, digitalisation and deglobalisation will alter the international economy with significant implications for the public finances. The establishment of the Future Ireland Fund and the Infrastructure, Climate and Nature Fund demonstrate the Government's commitment to taking a medium-term strategic focus in economic and budgetary policy. The Future Ireland Fund will help to ensure that volatile and potentially windfall receipts are not used to fund day-to-day expenditure, whilst helping to offset some of the fiscal impact of the future challenges, including the impact of demographics. The Infrastructure, Climate and Nature Fund will play an important role in securing the future investment needs are met by helping to ensure that capital expenditure is sustained throughout the economic cycle. So the strategy announced in the Summer Economic Statement today builds on the progress we've made around our public finances. It is announced in the context of remarkable resilience of our economy, which has been demonstrated in the face of the most severe shocks of modern times. While a strong economy is not an end in itself, it gives us the resources to provide high-quality public services that we are delivering today. The budgetary strategy outlined today prioritises supports to households and firms, the provision of additional public services, boosting the resilience of the economy and enhancing the capital stock, including in housing. And I'm confident that the strategy set out in the Summer Economic Statement for 2024 best places us in the best position possible to address the challenges and seizes the opportunities we will face going forward.
Thank you, and good afternoon to you all, and thank you for attending this press conference this afternoon, where we are communicating the key points of the Summer Economic Statement for 2024. The economic background has already been said very clearly by the Minister for Finance, Minister Chambers. I just want to emphasise two issues that are very relevant to the framing of our expenditure plans, not only for 2025 but beyond that. Firstly, I want to highlight where we are with regard to employment within our economy. We now have 2.8 million people at work in Ireland we'll have 2.8 million people at work in our economy in 2025. And that compares to just over 2.3 million people before the pandemic. Or to put that another way, 1 in 7 people who will be employed in that point were not employed on the eve of the pandemic. Growth in employment has also been accompanied by strong growth in population that is well above previous estimates. And the population is now approximately 180,000 people higher than anticipated when the medium-term expenditure strategy was published in 2021. And to emphasise that, by the time we get to next year, our population will be at a level that we previously estimated we would reach at the end of this decade. So that frames our expenditure planning for the years ahead. But with particular reference to 2025, which is the key subject of the economic statement, what we are doing is setting out today an overall expenditure ceiling of €105.4 billion. This is an increase of €6.9 billion over 2024. And of this, €5.1 billion is attributed to the costs of covering the existing level of service requirements in 2025, or the ELS, which includes the full year cost of the public service pay agreement of €1.2 billion, and decisions that have already been taken regarding capital allocations for next year. The remaining €1.8 billion will be subject to new measure announcements as part of the budget day process. And on a like-for-like basis, this is in line with the amounts provided for new current spending measures in Budget 2024. So in this regard, the expenditure ceiling set out in the summer economic statement will facilitate a budget that can cater for increasing levels of public service delivery due to a changing demographic profile, providing an increase of €5.5 billion on current expenditure, which is a 6.4% increase in current spending, and provide for further increased levels of investment in the National Development Plan through an increase of €1.4 billion over the 2024 investment. This can also accompany new measures that align in government priorities, including our work with regard to the National Training Fund, which is ongoing. A key element of the overall current expenditure amount for 2025 is it with regard to the level of health funding. Taking into account demands for better quality healthcare, the complexity of providing health services, and also where we are in the aftermath of an inflationary period and also the effect of the pandemic, significant additional funding is provided for the Department of Health. Following significant engagement, I and my officials have reached an agreement with the Department of Health and also with the HSE, which will provide an additional €1.5 billion for the health sector in 2024. In addition, I've also agreed that a further €1.2 billion will be allocated in 2025 for the existing level of service. As part of this agreement, the three parties have agreed that this additional funding provides an opportunity to strengthen financial planning and governance within the HSE, recognise the importance of demonstrating a clear link between the significant level of public funding being made available and how this translates into the delivery of improved outputs and better control. As regards investment, the budget strategy for 2025 reflects the National Development Plan. Capital expenditure has been prioritised in recent years, as shown by the additional €2.25 billion from 2024 to 2026, which was agreed, all of which has now been allocated to the NDP, meaning that overall capital investment in 2025 will now increase by €1.4 billion, an increase of 10.6%. While we operate in an uncertain international environment, it, as was clearly described there by the Minister for Finance, it is appropriate to maintain a contingency reserve within the overall expenditure amounts across the medium term as set out in the Stability Programme update. This approach continues to be followed in the SES, with the level of reserve to be determined each year as part of the overall estimate settlement. It is estimated that the full €4.5 billion, as set out in the Stability Programme update, will be required to meet the demands that we face. Finally, the parameters that are set out in the budget, as published today, provide for a level of increased expenditure growth that will deliver significant outputs and outcomes for our country. I believe it gets the balance right between keeping our public finances safe, getting ready for the risks of tomorrow, while also investing today in a range of policy areas and public services, including our National Development Plan, healthcare, increases in the number of nurses, Gardaí and teachers, and the ongoing rollout of enhanced funding, for example, for childcare schemes, including the National Childcare Subsidy and core funding. And I look forward now to continuing this work, to working with Minister Chambers in agreeing the final budget as we plan our path towards Budget Day on October the 1st. Thank you.
Total, John. Can I just go back to your second or third last slide there? Can I just confirm the €1.5 billion for health is in there? It's in that provision, is it?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah, and can I just ask Minister Donoghue, you mentioned here in the press release that it was around, I suppose, you said how it translates into delivery of improved healthcare outputs and better health outcomes. So do you anticipate that extra funding for next year to go towards those kind of mitigation measures, or have you asked, what specific actions have you asked to be taken?
So we've actually laid that out in the summer economic statement. In the summer economic statement, we've laid out the agreement that we have with the HSE and with the Department of Health regarding ensuring this money is used in a way that delivers against better health outcomes, but also the controls that need to be in place to ensure that this is a budget that is adhered to, not only now for this year with the significant additional funding that's been made available to them, but also for next year. And that principally regards the delivery of a recruitment strategy where the HSE will stay inside agreed staffing levels across this year and next, and also commitments with regard to the level of agency staff and overtime, and how that will be managed for this year and next year as well. Myself, the HSE and the Minister for Health have all agreed to these measures.
Can I also ask, John, you might be able to answer this one. We know under the new fiscal framework there's no differentiation anymore between core and non-core, but the last few years we've seen non-core allocation, I suppose, around €4.5 billion for things like Ukraine, kind of leftover COVID measures. Where has that gone now within this package? Where is it effectively?
So, well, I can deal with that. It's dealt with in the Stability Programme update. So, as I said there in my communication there a moment ago, this has been assumed in the figures that we've communicated today. That contingency reserve is maintained at €4.5 billion for this year and for next year. with that being maintained there for a number of years after that, with the anticipation of the vast majority of that being used to deal with refugee and international protection costs. Yes.
For both of you, last year when we saw the tax package, it ended up that people were about, I think it was €800 better off over the course of a year. It's significantly bigger this year. Do you think people are going to be maybe €1,000 better off after the budget in October? And then secondly, Roderick O'Gorman said yesterday when he was being anointed Green Party leader that, you know, he would be concentrating on the budget, but this couldn't be a giveaway pre-election budget. It's exactly what you're going to do though, isn't it?
No, on the tax question, obviously we've made no decisions on what the tax package will be, except to say that we obviously want to, a lot of workers have increased wages, and we want to make sure we're not levying taxation in the context of wage growth, and that's the kind of core basis on decisions around an income tax package which we'll develop. And obviously we had a tax package last year of about €1.1 billion on income tax, and it'll be around 1.4 this year. We have to decide what the mix of that will be, but clearly workers are a priority. They're seeing wage growth and they need to get a break in budget 2025. And on the wider question, this isn't a giveaway budget. It's a budget that, is, in terms of current expenditure, as Minister Donoghue outlined, replicates what happened last year. The core context in terms of the 8.3 billion that's set out is the cost of the existing levels of service combined with healthcare costs and the government's prioritisation of housing in terms of growing our capital plans and our infrastructure through the National Development Plan is what the mix is in the context of Budget 2025. And ministers will have to prioritise within their departments about what funding asks they want to see progressed in 2025, because there's more limited room for manoeuvre than there would have been during COVID and during the cost of living crisis when we had that split between core and non-core. We're entering a more regular budgetary environment, and they'll need to be cognizant of that when they're engaging with Minister Donoghue on their spending asks.
And the figures speak for themselves in relation to how the budget is going to be described. Out of all the additional funding that is laid out up there, €1.8 billion of it is available for new measures, as Minister Chambers has said, which is exactly in line with what we did a year ago. And much of that will be absorbed by putting together a social welfare package. All the other figures that are up there are either about delivering a wage agreement for public services that is in line with wage growth in the economy, not ahead of us. That took the best part of a year to negotiate. Number two, it is in relation to how we implement the capital commitments we already have. And then finally, it is about how we maintain the existing levels of service within the health service. So the biggest figures are up there are about how we stay still from a public service delivery point of view, or we deliver against capital commitments that we have already made. And given that new policy decisions are going to be in line with where we were a year ago, and there will be no new non-core expenditure for 2025, this is a budget that tries to get the balance right, and I believe does so. And just to go back to a key point that has already been made, all of this also rests on not spending €6 billion. So the government is going to deliver against our commitment to put €6 billion into the two funds that will be set up by the Department of Finance that they have just passed the legislation for. So the broader picture in all of these figures is we are putting in place two large deposits into two funds for the future. That is nearly comparable to all of the additional spending that we are doing next year.
John, can I just ask, the 8.3 billion number there for the budget package, that's grown successively over the last few years. Is that the biggest package we've ever had? Can you recall it ever been bigger? And can you maybe give us a little context around that? And Minister Donoghue, on the health spending, last week Minister Donnelly said in the Shannon that the 19 million that he gave to Children's Health Ireland for the scoliosis surgery fund was spent, the majority of it was spent elsewhere by CHI. Can you give your response to that as Minister for Public Expenditure, and especially at a time when you're greenlighting significant increases in funding for the health service?
I mean, the 8.3 is a 6.9% increase. Obviously, during COVID, the increases in spending, be it core and non-core and all that, was a lot larger. But the 8.3, I mean, 6.9% is. I'd have to check how much larger it is than previous packages, and I can maybe come back to you.
And look, in terms of percentage increases, other budgets that the government has done, certainly from a current spending perspective, we're ahead of that. But we're in a completely different environment now, and not obviously dealing with the impact of a pandemic or other challenges the government has had to deal with. And then in relation to the allocation of funding and the concerns that Minister Donnelly raised, I fully share the concerns that he has. We want to ensure that funding that we are making available is, in the particular case of those children and families who are dealing with such a difficult health condition, that funding that has been made available for operations to help to alleviate the pain that they're in, that is used in the way the government has intended. And in relation to the additional settlement that we have here today, this is the culmination of many weeks' worth of discussion and engagement with the HSE and with the Department of Health. We are expecting that this will allow us to meet the existing demands that are on our health service for this year and for next year, and to fund them in a way that we believe is sustainable. But it is accompanied then by clear commitments in relation to staffing and then the management of overtime of agency staff, which we believe will also allow this to continue to flow into the operations and support that patients need.
Thanks. First, for Minister Donoghue, seeing as you designed the rule, what is the point of the 5% spending rule? And just for Minister Chambers, you said there's going to be a surplus of just under $6 billion for next year. That's down on 9.7 forecast in April. How much do you intend to put into the two savings funds next year? Because you don't have the same $6 billion on those figures. And sorry, lastly, will there be a package of one-off measures in the budget as well this year?
Well, the 5% rule has already performed a very important service, in that it ensured that when we came out of the pandemic environment, we had the downward pressure on public spending and an anchor that we were aiming to. And I'm confident that we wouldn't have been in a position that we've been running surpluses over the last number of years at such a level if we didn't have a 5% spending target in place. Obviously, we're not in a position where we're meeting that figure today. But what we are indicating is further surpluses for this year and next year. But again, if I look at the components of that figure, the components of that figure are how we maintain existing services to our country in our health services, and how we can ensure that, for example, a public pay agreement that is in line with wage growth that is happening across the rest of our economy is funded and paid for across next year. These figures are not driven by us allocating additional money that we have in recent years for new decisions. It is mostly driven by the impact of maintaining what we have and ensuring that we can properly fund that next year. So the 5% rule has played an important role in us helping to get back to a level of spending that has enabled us then to deliver the surpluses that we have. And the reason we're not at that figure today is because of the figures that I've outlined and the reasons that I've outlined.
So on your question for next year, so we expect a surplus of in and around €6 billion, and that will allow us to transfer €4 billion to the Future Ireland Fund and €2 billion to the Infrastructure, Climate and Nature Fund. By the end of this year, we expect to have €10 billion in those funds and €16 billion by the end of 2025. So we're serious about ensuring we have that counter-cyclical buffer in place for the medium to long term to deal with the challenges which will crystallise at some point. In terms of demographics, we know the wider concerns on deglobalisation, the impact on trade and other areas of concern which have been well identified by the Department. Around one-off measures and cost of living, that'll be considered by Government closer to the budget itself. I think we are in a different cycle of inflation, with the flash inflation figures for June at 1.5%. But we recognise as well that there are specific challenges for particular families. We, in the context of the €1.8 billion, which has been outlined by Minister Donoghue, there'll obviously be a social protection package within that, which is there to support those most in need. But there'll be further consideration within government of any specific measures on cost of living closer to budget time.
Ministers, good afternoon. What is your message to your colleagues in the ministerial corridor who are going to be knocking your door down ahead of the election, saying we need more money and we need it now to get our seats?
Just on that, I mean, we've seen an enormous expansion of the state since we entered office as a government over 4 years ago, and what we've sought to do in this is to embed those public services, and that's why we're seeing over €5 billion being allocated between current and capital for existing levels of service. So this is about sustaining and properly funding the serious expansion of public services that we've seen over the past years, and it's about strengthening those for the future. But juxtaposed with that is the need to ensure that not only are we building a bigger state, but it has to be a better state, and we have to look at outputs in the context of the wider public services that we've sought to deliver. And to Minister Donoghue's point on health, for example, a significant expansion of health spending, but we now need to see serious conditionality, and that's what's being worked through with Minister Donoghue, Minister Donnelly and the HSE on seeing measurable outputs from that with the investment we're putting into our health service. But there is scope for some new measures in the context of €1.8 billion, but they'll have to be ministers will have to prioritise within the €1.8 billion, and clearly from a tax perspective the focus is on supporting workers and ensuring that they're not excessively levied with tax as their incomes rise. So in that context, I think that this is about sustaining the services that we've delivered over the last 4 years, and then being careful about our new expenditure measures, which is similar to last year in the context of €1.8 billion.
So this is a question that's put to me again and again in the different estimates meetings that I do, and then also in the engagement that we will have before the budget with the variety of different stakeholders that we meet. One of the key questions I get asked is, if we have a surplus of €6 billion, why don't we spend some of that to expand our new measures package, to respond back to some of the issues that we will hear again and again in the run-up to the budget. And the announcement today that the new measures package is in line with where we were a year ago is, I know, going to give lots of ministers food for consideration and for thought as we approach Budget 2025. But as we have said again and again at other points in recent years, the reason why we are running a surplus is of the strong view of myself, Minister Chambers and our officials, that a portion of the tax that we are collecting in corporate tax may not be available to us at some point in the future. And what we are doing is not spending a share of that money. And that is why we have, with some confidence, are able to say that the spending increases that we've had in recent years will be able to maintain the quality of public service that we are delivering in the coming years, even if times get difficult again, because we are trying to avoid money that we may not always have funding our public services. So that's the argument that I will continue to make, and I'm confident that we will deliver our budget inside the parameters that are outlined up there.
Minister Donoghue, for you, but I know both ministers have mentioned this in the context of the 1.8, a significant social welfare package. Does that mean that those in receipt of social welfare payments, pensioners, will be seeing another double-digit increase in their weekly rate come budget time? And Minister Chambers, you mentioned on the tax side of things, it's about making sure people get the rises in their incomes and it's not levied. Again, will that be further increases in the threshold of the higher rate of income tax like we saw in the previous budget, or are you thinking of something else? And on that,
is that third rate of tax that Leo Varadkar pushed for, is that dead now? And just finally, can I ask on a different topic? This afternoon, a woman in her 70s became the 100th person to die on our roads this year, and obviously that was your previous portfolio, Minister Chambers. Do you have any reaction to that? And is there anything, even in the context of the budget, that the government will be doing to increase road safety?
In relation to the social welfare package, Elaine, we have not engaged at all with Minister Humphreys regarding what the level of social welfare increases will be. We have to work all that out. The nature of those agreements with regard to social welfare and tax tend to happen towards the end of the budget process. So I imagine it will be late September until we are clear on what the social welfare package will be. Keeping point in all of this, though, is even with all of the expectations and demands that are there, our new measures package is in line with a year ago. It's not bigger than a year ago. And everybody will have to work inside those parameters. I'm sorry to hear of the loss of life that you've referred to a moment ago. Obviously, in my engagement with Minister Ryan, I'm a former Minister for Transport myself, I appreciate how hugely important road safety is, and I'm conscious of the further progress that we need to make.
So on the income tax package, obviously we'll be prioritising low and middle income earners so that it's progressive, but we want to make sure that as wage inflation occurs that we're not excessively levying tax, and that's the basis upon which you design an income tax package. How that's progressed, we'll all engage in that closer to the time in September, but we haven't yet worked through how that will be calibrated, except to say it'll be progressive, and obviously we'll support low and middle income earners as an absolute priority. My condolences are with the woman who lost her life in that accident, and as you've said, 100 lives lost on our roads this year, a shocking continuation of the trend that we saw last year. We passed important road safety legislation earlier on this year, some of which has commenced, some of which will make a really important impact later on this year in the context of changing the baseline of speed limits we've seen nationwide. And there's work ongoing between the Department of Transport and all local authorities on progressing that, so we have a much safer baseline speed limit and addressing the inconsistency and fragmentation that we've had in our country for far too long. Secondly, there's an important body of work around the future of the Road Safety Authority, and I understand that there's interim recommendations which could be brought to government in the coming weeks, which are about examining how the Road Safety Authority can be best placed to fulfil its remit for road safety in the future. And I know Minister Ryan and Lawless will be engaging with Minister Donoghue on how the Road Safety Authority can be best placed for 2025. And on a broader point, I would say if you look at the existing levels of service we're providing for in terms of public services, having full and ongoing Garda recruitment and strengthening our roads policing units is an important part of this budgetary framework. We're continuing to support the recruitment of frontline public servants, including members of An Garda Síochána, and that will help the wider enforcement work that I know is progressing between the Road Safety Authority and An Garda Síochána. Look, we'll set out the tax package on budget day, and as I've said, it'll be progressive and again support low middle income earners as a priority. What I would say on income tax, I mean, there's a wider risk at the moment which has been identified in some of the documents published by the department. We have 20% of earners pay 80% of income tax, and there's a concentration risk in income tax in addition to corporation tax, which has been identified. So when we're calibrating any tax package, again, we have to be cognizant of that if any future risks crystallise in the future. And as I've said, €1.4 billion available there, and the majority of it will be going to make sure we offset wage inflation so people aren't excessively levied. And how we design that is the work we'll be advancing and agreeing in the coming weeks.
Minister Chambers, I wondered what you think the central bank governor would make of this, given he only said last week it's sensible to stick to the 5% spending rule, and you've obviously not stuck to it.
Yeah, look, we take very seriously obviously the input from the central bank and the Fiscal Advisory Council. We've set out clearly the basis upon which we've had to adjust that for 2025. That's for increased capital spending, which I think is an important investment for the future, delivering on housing, delivering on wider infrastructure like in transport, and fulfilling the objectives we have in the National Development Plan. Secondly, to ensure that our existing levels of public services can be sustained and supported next year. We don't want to compromise the investment and support we've placed in those for 2025. There is a higher cost to providing the existing levels of public services and a lagging effect of inflation. We had a high inflationary environment in the previous 2 years, and the cost of providing the same levels of public services have increased. And as Minister Donoghue mentioned, we've tried to put health funding on a more sustainable trajectory with conditionality, and I think that'll be an important measure now for the HSE to ensure that they bring greater financial control and productivity with their existing levels of service for 2024 and 2025. And Minister Donnelly has advanced significant work on driving better productivity across our health system in the context of a serious uplift in the government's support for the HSE. And I suppose our support for new spending measures is similar to last year, and our new taxation measures is revenue neutral. So obviously the increased wages and increased people working in the economy allows us to offset the tax package that's outlined there.
Just on the tax measures, I think it's 1.4 billion. I mean, it looks like, just from what you said in the last few minutes, it will largely be taken up by income tax indexation, USC changes as it did last year. How much do you envisage will be left after that, and what will those measures potentially look like? And then a question for Mr. McCarthy. Of the 4.5 billion, I think it is, that is the international protection, kind of the old non-core expenditure. How much does that 4.5 billion make up of the 6.9% increase in net spending? Like, if we got rid of that in the morning, would we be back down at 5%?
So, on your question on the tax package, we haven't yet decided how we're going to calibrate it. Clearly, the less you do on an income tax, the more opportunity you have for other measures. But the vast majority of the particular package will be on helping and supporting workers and giving them a break in 2025 in terms of income tax. There's limited scope for a major advancement in other changes to taxation. Obviously, we will be examining other measures as well, but clearly the significant percentage of it will be taken up by changes to income tax in the context of rising wages.
Just on the point in relation to the 4.5 billion, we set out in the Stability Programme update a contingency reserve of 4.5 billion, which was in line with what we're spending on COVID-related measures and accommodation in relation to people fleeing the war in Ukraine. So we're assuming within the projections for 2025 that 4.5 billion will be required next year. So it isn't a level shift. It is the same spending in 2020, level of spending in 2024 and 2025. So it is not part of the 6.9 billion and 6.9% growth.
Sorry to come back to the indexation issue again, but there's some estimates that meeting the cost of rising wages would be about 1.2 billion euros. That would leave you with 200 million. In terms of that, that doesn't give you a lot of scope for a lot of things. Is that fair to say? And in terms of the one-off measures, what would be will it essentially come down to a judgment call on how much money you put away and how much money you think it's safe to put out there without overheating the economy?
So we've more people in employment, and that's why we're closer to 1.4 billion euro. And yes, by doing an income tax package, there will be much more limited scope to advance any other major change in taxation. And I think that's the proper approach. We've a significant spending increase next year to fund public services. We should appropriately adjust taxation so we're not excessively levying income tax when you've wage growth. And that's striking the appropriate balance in terms of our wider fiscal plan. We'll obviously have to agree and discuss what the tax package will be. In terms of your question on the economy, we're trying to strike a balance here. In terms of supporting existing levels of service, that's over €5 billion. Again, a portion of that is on capital investment. There's absolute consensus across from all experts on the need to drive greater investment in infrastructure and housing to meet the future needs of our economy and society, and that's why that's a portion of the increased expenditure growth. And I think I would argue others will argue for a lot more spending and changes to taxation, and we've sought to strike the balance on that.
And just on the one-offs, we'll make the decision in relation to their scale and level a lot closer budget day. Clearly, we're at a lower level of inflation within our economy than we have been in recent years, and we'll have to consider that as we approach making these decisions. But when we've done other budgets in recent years, we have been called upon again and again not to do anything that will add to inflation. And the fact that inflation is at the level that it is now within the Irish economy does show that the budget decisions that we have made have not contributed to inflation being any higher in Ireland than it is elsewhere in Europe. We're below 2% in Ireland now on the last read. So we've got the balance right, and I'm confident that when we make our final decisions on how we can respond back to challenges that are still there, that we'll help but not add to inflation within Ireland.
Minister Chambers, just for clarity on the one-off measures, I know it has been flagged before over the last few months that energy credits could possibly could be on the cards. Are you saying you're not ruling them out at the moment? It's still up for discussion. And is there any message to the energy companies? Are you satisfied with the level in which they've brought down their prices, or would you be calling for more reductions in the summer months as we get closer to the budget before you make that decision? We have discussed a lot of issues here in terms of health spending and all the rest, but can you possibly speak to the ambitions you have for housing within this budget? I know within your own party there have been promises made, even from the Taoiseach, I think, about increasing that rent tax credit again this year. Is that likely to be on the cards? And just a final issue on childcare. I know Roderick O'Gorman was quite late in the day in terms of his discussions and getting what he wanted for this September, for those changes to come in for reduced childcare fees. Are you minded to reduce that further, or will there be, I suppose, more headbutting towards the end of these August negotiations as we get closer?
Yeah, so on your question on energy prices, we'll obviously decide a cost of living supports closer to budget time and what that will be. We're in a much different inflation environment than we were last year and indeed the year before. But we want to see the wholesale energy prices passed on to consumers. There's been some progress on that. But clearly we need to see more of that over the coming period of months and weeks and months, and that will, I suppose, that will dictate what's possible or what the level of intervention might be for later on in the year or indeed early next year. But I think any further intervention on one-off measures will be of a much lower scale than we saw in previous years, because we're in a different inflationary environment. And we want to get back to more regular budgeting. In terms of your question on housing, obviously the supporting renters and driving affordability in our wider housing system is an absolute priority. That's why the additional investment on capital in particular will make a difference on driver grading supply in the housing system, which Minister Donoghue has worked with Minister O'Brien on in the context of Housing for All. And Minister O'Brien will be bringing forward new targets on housing delivery, as you know, in the coming period. But that will be a consideration in terms of our tax package, how we can further support renters who I know face high rents in many parts of our country. And again, that's striking the balance between on the income tax side and on other priority levels of support in terms of the rental system and indeed housing as well. Do you want to come in on the childcare?
In relation to childcare, we'll make all the decisions on childcare and other spending matters in September. And at that point, there are so many wants, and each minister has different priorities they want to progress, and always approaches the budget process with lots of policies that they want to deliver. But the key point is all of those needs will have to fit inside the figures that we are announcing today, which are in line with where we were a year ago, and that must be recognised in the discussions that I'll have with all ministers. It's not about headbutting. This is the final budget of this government. We've delivered 4. We're back in a position of running surpluses. We believe we've got the balance right in the last number of years, and we will come to reach a good set of agreements in relation to this final budget. And I will do that with Minister O'Gorman, new leader of the Green Party, and with every other leader and minister as well.
Minister Chambers, you've described the tax side of the package very much on income tax, and so there was very little scope for anything else in that. So am I correct, you're ruling out 9% VAT rate for hospitality, which would be a big cost and doesn't seem to fit in what you're describing?
Well, I think that will be a political choice for the three parties. Clearly, examining whether we want to help workers for Budget 2025 and the fact that we've wage growth in our economy, or examining the VAT 9, and both of which have a significant cost. But we're clear in terms of the tax package of what it'll be and the parameters of it, and decisions on that will be taken, as I've said, closer to budget time. But there isn't scope for every measure that every person is going to look for within the wider system, and that's our role in government. Both of us as ministers with responsibility in this area will have to prioritise, and different ministers in terms of their engagement with us will also have to do that to make sure we can sustain decisions for the future. And that's what the key focus of Budget 2025 will be, is sustaining and building the strong level of investment in public services, but making sure that in 5 to 10 years that the investments of today can be sustained to that point, and that we have the money set aside for counter-cyclical intervention at a time when the economy mightn't be where it is today. And that's how we're framing this budget, and that's why there's limited scope for new measures on tax and spending.
Notwithstanding the statements that you're making about funds being put aside for demographic changes, at some point a government's going to have to make a decision on how to fund pensions, health care services differently than we are now, surely. So is that an issue that the next